The 8th Angel, Ascension. For Elektra and Hellcat. Just for the hell of it. The Dark One will rise. Heaven's 8th Angel shall confront him. A battle will ensue. An outcome unknown will reign. Taken from the books of the Arcane, Vol. 13. Prologue. I woke up, sweating and gasping for breath. Mike. Jez's voice. Did you have another nightmare? I laid my head back on the pillow. Not exactly. She stroked my hair gently. It's him, isn't it? You saw him again, didn't you? Like that night in that church. I nodded. Jez? Are you sure you didn't see anything too, that night? Positive, hon. If you hadn't warned me, I wouldn't have known he was there at all. I shook my head. I just don't get it. 1. It'd been 5 years since that bizarre night in the church. I'd been slaying vampires like I always have. I never quite understood what the outcome of the bloodstorm was. Father Sanchez had been out of reach for a while, but I came across a bit of luck. So there I was, on a plane to Mexico with Jez. In my pocket was a piece of paper with an unconfirmed address. I was very doubtful as to whether it would lead to anything. But I had to find him. The nightmares were starting to get to me. Jez was great. If it wasn't for her, I'd probably have gone insane. She was so genuinely caring. As we sat there in the plane, occasionally talking, I tried not to sleep. I didn't want to see him again. Dhrovu. What kind of a name was that, anyway? Dhrovu. For so many years, I'd been hoping to run into this so-called leader of the vampires. When I finally do, he appears to be nothing more than some kind of ghost. A ghost that won't let me sleep in peace. Father Sanchez had better have some answers. Assuming we could find him. As the plane touched down at Mexico City Airport, I found myself cheering up a little. That side of me which loved adventure started to come to the forefront. Here I was, arriving in Mexico with Jez, the girl I loved. It was exciting. Anything could happen. After all, this was where it all began, so many years ago. Perhaps it was partially destiny that brought me back here. As we stepped off the plane, the first thing that struck us was the heat wave. It was sweltering. I was sweating already, unlike Jez. The airport was busy and bustling with hordes of people. We had to wait a while in a queue to check in before we could collect our baggage. We wasted no time after collecting our suitcases. The first thing we did next was catch a taxi to our hotel in Pueblo. We were both thankful for the air conditioning in the taxi. The drive wasn't very long, and the friendly driver carried on an interesting conversation with us all the way. After we were dropped off outside our hotel in Pueblo, we thanked the cab driver and paid him. We then checked in. Our room was comfy, with a double bed and TV. I switched on the television, and a commercial for nachos came on. It made me hungry. I considered ordering room service, but that made a memory flash through my mind. My best friend, Rick, had been bitten by a vampire who brought room service into our motel room all those years ago. I felt a sudden hollow, sad loss at what had become of Rick. Jez seemed to sense my despair, and put her arm around my shoulder and squeezed it. "What's wrong?" she asked. I shook my head. "It's nothing. I just remembered how my vampire slaying quest began, that's all." She kissed me softly on the cheek. "Don't dwell on the past." I nodded. "It's pointless." I tried to cheer up. "Let's go have something to eat." ******. The hotel's restaurant had a great array of Mexican food. Jez and I settled for nachos with sour cream. We chose beer for drinks. The food was delicious, and had that authentic Mexican taste which could only be savored in Mexico. We talked about the happy times we'd spent together, and recalled how lucky we were to be able to cure Jez of her vampirism. "God knows what state I'd be in if I was still a bloodsucker," she said. "Yet. Thank God you're not one of them anymore. She shook her head. No. Thank Pandora. A corner of my mouth tilted up. Yet. I wonder if we'll ever see her again. Who knows, said Jez, munching on a nacho. We might need her help again. I nodded. Yet. We just might. On the one hand, I hated to think we'd need her help again, but on the other, I wouldn't have minded seeing her again. I tried to focus my mind on why we'd come to Mexico. We have to find Father Sanchez, I said. We need to know more about Dhrovu. Jez looked concerned. Maybe we don't. Don't you want to just forget about him? That way, you won't have those nightmares anymore. I shook my head. That's just the point. I can't seem to avoid the nightmares, or visions, whatever you wanna call them. It's like he's haunting me or something. Jez's expression seemed to turn to one of genuine caring. Don't worry, Han will find a way to get him out of your head. I smiled for Jez's benefit. Thanks, babe. I think that's where Father Sanchez comes in. 2. Back in our hotel room, we relaxed for a while, watching TV. A goofy Mexican comedy was on, with no subtitles. It soon got me laughing though, while Jez was merely amused. A half hour later, as a subtitled run of Hellboy came on, I sat up. I really don't want to wait till tomorrow to try and find Father Sanchez, I said. Jez nodded. I understand. Can I come with you? I considered it for a few seconds. Sure. Just be ready for anything. Okay. What about weapons? I slapped my head. Geez. Good point. For a moment there, I think I kinda slipped back into my old life, before all this vampire shit. Again, Jez looked concerned. Are you sure you're up to this, Mike? You haven't had much sleep, either. Tough. Besides, I'm kinda counting on Father Sanchez telling me a way to get rid of the nightmares. If you're sure. But where do we get some weapons at such short notice? I can look up an old contact. Come on, let's not waste any more time. We left the hotel as quietly as possible, trying to draw as little attention to ourselves as possible. The lobby was almost empty, which suited me just fine. Luckily, I knew of a mutual contact of both Father Sanchez's and mine who lived within walking distance of the hotel, so we didn't need to worry about transport. We soon arrived at the tiny house occupied by Lopez, a merchant who dealt with only the highest grade weapons. He was pleased to see me. Kaine, he said, in his loud but warm voice, what on earth brings you to this part of the world? I grinned. How are you, Lopez? It's good to see you again. This is Jez, my partner. I gestured towards Jez, then said, say hi to Lopez, Jez. Lopez politely lifted Jez's hand and kissed it. Much delighted to make your acquaintance, beautiful señorita. Jez smiled. Hello, Lopez. Nice to meet you. Lopez turned his attention to me, his eyebrows raised. What can I do for you, Señor Kaine? 2 things, I said. 1, I'll need some new weapons. 2, I'm trying to get in touch with our old friend, Father Sanchez. Lopez's eyes took on a sad appearance. Weapons, not a problem. But Father Sanchez, Señor, a different matter. He shook his head. I have not heard from the priest in over 5 years. I nodded grimly. I was afraid you might say that. I dug into the right front pocket of my jeans and pulled out the piece of paper with the address on it. Any idea what this place is? I handed him the piece of paper. He looked at it for several seconds, then nodded. Here you will find an old church, Señor. It has been left abandoned for many years. I doubt you will find anyone there, let alone our friend. He looked at me seriously. If I may ask, Señor Kaine, where did you get this address? I wrote to Father Sanchez's old address, hoping to hear from him, a while back. All I got was a short note from the new resident of the address, along with this one. The note just said that Father Sanchez had moved away, and that this might be of use. Lopez nodded. Ah, I see. Well, good luck to you, Señor. He gave me back the piece of paper and shook my hand firmly. Wait a minute, I said. What about the weapons? He'd already turned away. Looking over his shoulder, he said, You will have no need for weapons if you're going to the abandoned church addressed on that piece of paper, Señor. With that, he nodded at both of us and walked back into his house, shutting the door quietly. Jez and I exchanged glances. We'll probably need to catch a cab, I said. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. We paid the cab driver and got out of the taxi. After the vehicle was driven off, we looked around. Across the dusty road was the abandoned church. Not a single light seemed to be on. The night was warm, and there was a reasonable amount of moonlight illuminating the shoddy-looking building. We crossed the road. The front doors of the building were boarded up with large wooden planks which were nailed to the frame. Maybe there's a back entrance, I said. Jez and I walked along the left side of the fairly large building, passing windows which were dark and reflected the moonlight eerily. The rear of the building had a small door, which, to our relief, wasn't boarded shut like the front entrance. I looked at Jez to make sure she was ready. She nodded. I knocked loudly on the wooden door. After maybe 5 minutes, we heard bolts being pulled open on the other side. Finally, the door opened inwards, slowly and with a creak. Jez and I stared at the man looking back at us. For several moments, I could not recognize the hooded man who stood at the doorway, a large beard nearly concealing what little we could see of his face. But then, a smile seemed to light up the stranger's face. The smile turned into a loud, delighted laugh. I'd know that laugh anywhere. Unable to control myself, I started to laugh too. Soon, me and the man at the door were so racked with spasms of laughter that Jez looked from one of us to the other as if we were a pair of crazy fools. Eventually, our laughter grew quiet and died away. We cleared our throats. My son, said Father Sanchez. I cannot believe my eyes. Please, come in. He opened the door wider and stepped back. Jez and I entered the old, run-down church. 3. The rear interior of the church was musty and warm, and smelled mostly of wood. We could hear a dripping sound, coming from nearby. The messy little room into which Father Sanchez led us had a few furnishings, a small table, 5 wooden chairs, a small cupboard and a few barrels. He gestured for us to sit down. Jez and I pulled up a couple of chairs to the table and sat down. Father Sanchez also pulled up a chair and seated himself. He drew back his hood. His appearance gave me the impression of a reclusive hermit. So, he began. You flew from Arizona. I nodded. Yet. We were doubtful about finding you. His expression saddened. I'm so sorry, Señor. I feel I have let you down. If you're angry, you have every right to be. I felt pity within my heart. No, Father. I'm not angry. I'm just confused. Ah. You are indeed as noble as ever, Kaine. But still, I am not completely undeserving to be blamed. I chose my words carefully. Father Sanchez, what exactly happened? Did the blood storm actually occur? He nodded gravely. I'm afraid so, my son. Even as we speak, the apocalypse is upon us. He looked at me as if awaiting another question, but I remained silent. He carried on, you see, there was really nothing any of us could have done to prevent it. His expression turned sadder. Unfortunately, I underestimated Dhrovu. My confidence in you was too great. About Dhrovu. I saw him 5 years ago. In a church. I've been having these nightmares, visions about him. They keep me up at night. I was hoping maybe you might have some answers. Si, Señor. This is exactly my point. He is much more powerful than I anticipated. While you were busy killing all those vampires, he has been rising to power in secret, without our knowledge. He hesitated. I leveled my eyes with him. I need to know more. Father Sanchez nodded. I will tell you everything I know. He has much power. I have learned that he can manifest in various forms. Sometimes he appears as a spectre, a ghost. My guess is that this is how he first showed himself to you. I nodded. That's a pretty accurate way to describe it. Si. But this was merely a challenge, or an omen. He looked at me seriously. His way of saying, face me if you dare. I listened intently. Tell me more about the blood storm. Father Sanchez shook his head gravely. I know very little, my son. The outcome was not as I predicted. You see, it happened, literally. My mind flashed back to the day Jez and I investigated Dhrovu's home, the blood that poured down in torrents outside. But what exactly does that mean? I'm sorry, Señor, but, in all honesty, I don't know. His eyes held my gaze. But Dhrovu is out there, and he wants you perished. Jez spoke for the first time. Is that all you can tell us, Father? I'm afraid so, my dear. I am sorry. Don't be, Father, I said. I understand why you disappeared, now. You felt ashamed at being wrong about the outcome, you felt you'd let me down. That is correct, Señor. He looked down at the table sadly. A familiar swell of determination started to rise up within me. You know what, I said. Let's send this Dhrovu back where he came from. Big time. A smile turned a corner of the priest's mouth upwards. Still the same old Kaine, Señor. You can count on it, I said. Then, so, where do we begin? For a moment, Father Sanchez looked thoughtful. He then spoke to Jez. Can you give me a few private moments with this fine young man, my dear? What? Asked Jez, humorously. He just wants to talk to me in private, I told her, a little amused. Jez looked at us from one to the other. Oh. No problem. She got up and walked towards an open door, which led into the main part of the church. Now, Señor, began Father Sanchez, I have some important information regarding your birthright. You have been slaying vampires for over 15 years now. You have proved yourself to be a true champion, and have certainly lived up to your title as the Messiah. I shrugged. Well, I've certainly worked hard to protect us humans from those nasty bloodsuckers. Si. The gods are always watching over you. They know how important you are. They will soon be rewarding you. I frowned. How? In the Book of Lore, this is referred to as ascension. Isn't that a term from the Bible? That refers to a different savior, Señor. I wasn't sure how to take this. I am still human, aren't I? Very much so. But a human with a destiny, an obligation, if you will. I nodded. No need to go through all that again. So, what kind of new powers will I be given? Father Sanchez smiled slyly. Ah, Señor, you will know when the time comes. I nodded. All right. So we're back in business. The priest grinned warmly. Does Señor Kaine like nachos? 4. It was after 3 in the morning by the time Jez and I left the rundown church. Back in our hotel room, we practically fell onto the bed. We were exhausted and excited. Jez turned her head towards me. So, she said. You and Father Sanchez are working together again, hey? Yeah. Just like the good old days. Did he give you any advice about the nightmares? Not exactly. I think he really wants me to take more responsibility, you know? Instead of turning to him every time I'm confused about something. She moved her head up and down against the bed sheet. Yet. You're not a little boy anymore. She poked her tongue at me. A corner of my mouth tilted upwards. Then, my expression turned serious. We have to destroy Dhrovu. But how? There has to be a way. Father Sanchez told me that it's important that I follow my instincts. I see. What else did you guys talk about? Lots. We pretty much caught up and updated each other on what we got up to the past 5 years. He's been living like a hermit. Did you get any specific assignments? I moved my head up and down. As a matter of fact, yes I did. I'm off to St. Petersburg in Russia. You coming? Jez's expression turned to one of delight. Are you kidding? You bet your vampire kickin' ass I'm coming. I grinned. Great. Basically, I have to track down this notorious bloodsucker who's said to be prowling the streets over there. Kind of a serial vampire. Jez wrinkled her nose. Sounds dangerous. I winked. They don't call me a messiah for nothing, babe. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Our Aeroflot flight arrived in St. Petersburg's Pulkovo 2 airport on a wet and rainy Friday morning. We made sure we had thick coats on before we stepped out of the 747. Airport procedures were slow, and we had a lot of waiting to do during customs. Instead of producing a license suggesting undercover business, Father Sanchez had recommended that we appeared as nothing more than tourists. In fact, that made my status even more undercover. Jez was excited just to be in Russia, while I felt my sense of responsibility lukewarm my own excitement. This was definitely going to be a tough assignment. I'd never dealt with a serial vampire before. This creature, who supposedly went by the name of Ruggiero, was said to be primal and animalistic, with almost no sense of civil behavior. I was advised by Father Sanchez to try and think like my target, that way, I stood a chance of second-guessing his methods. Outside the airport, we rushed up to a taxi, carrying our suitcases. We were a little wet as we climbed in. The drive to our hotel was a short one. The cabbie, a native of Leningrad, wasn't very fluent in his English, but we could make out most of what he said. He recommended a few sites, which he insisted we shouldn't miss out on seeing. However, I didn't think we'd have too much spare time for that sort of thing. As we arrived at our hotel, the rain was pouring down. We pulled our coats tightly around us as we walked towards the 4-star hotel. In the lobby, we were given our room key, as well as a card which carried phone numbers for services etc. When we entered our room, we found our suitcases already waiting for us. Jez was excited, as usual. I can't believe it, she said, grinning. We're in Russia. I couldn't help but smile. Yeah, how about that, hey? We looked around the hotel room. It was spacious, had a grand double bed, a large TV and a coffee machine to go. I sure felt like a cup just then. I was about to make myself one, when Jez jumped up from her position on the bed and insisted that she'd do it. I shook my head. You really are something, you know that. I said. Well, she said, in a little girl voice. I am the Messiah's girl, after all. I chuckled. Don't make it too strong, okay? She looked over her shoulder and winked. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. I quickly went through Father Sanchez's assignment instructions. Once again, it was very scant, but it gave me a good idea where to begin my mission. This Ruggiero was truly vicious and relentless. I had no idea what I was up for. After ordering Jez to remain in our room, I left to find a secretly located weapons stash. It was 5 miles from our motel, so I took a cab to the general area. A 20-minute walk from my arrival spot took me deep into a forest, where I came across a bunker in a well-secluded clearing. This was a secret hiding place for soldiers during the Cold War. The door wasn't even locked. It creaked heavily as I opened it. It was very dark inside, so I switched on my penlight torch. At the back of the bunker, I found a wooden lid concealing an opening in the ground. With some effort, I managed to force it open, and bingo, there was the stash of weapons. I pulled out a stake bow, 5 stakes, and a fully loaded automatic .22 pistol. I smirked. Nice. I also found a box full of ammunition for the pistol. Gathering my bearings, I cautiously walked out of the bunker. A mild breeze managed to chill me as I made my way out of the forest. With the stake bow concealed beneath my jacket along with the stakes, I had the pistol ready by the time I was at the side of the road leading back to the city limits. The box of ammunition was safely concealed within the rear right pocket of my jeans. Unfortunately, I had to walk all the way back to the hotel. I made sure the pistol was safely hidden in the waistband of my jeans, the whole time I was in the vicinity of the city. Back in my room, I watched some television with Jez. A Russian opera show was showing, with English subtitles that I couldn't be bothered reading. I was tired. Jez stroked my hair, occasionally massaging my scalp. It felt really good. I started to feel sleepy. Just as I dozed off, Jez changed the TV channel. My eyes opened wide with shock at what I saw on the screen. 5. The evening news was on. A news crew was at the scene of a hideous homicide. Carcasses could be seen being put into body bags and zipped up. There appeared to be human limbs strewn about here and there, in random places. Onlookers were hysteric, apparently saying some hideous animal had been feeding on the victims. It didn't take me long to realize that what I was watching was the work of Ruggiero himself. ******. The next day was a cold one, rain once again pelting the St. Petersburg streets harshly and mercilessly. I wasn't in the best of moods, having had another nightmare the previous night. But I was up for the forthcoming challenge. I didn't waste any time in heading for the banks of the Neva River, where the serial vampire had struck the previous night. As I walked the distance to the river, the rain battered me unrelentingly, making me huddle myself up, drawing my jacket tightly around me. The stake bow pressed against my ribs, making me very uncomfortable. But I had to keep it concealed, along with the stakes and the pistol. At the river bank, I stopped and had a good look around. There were no people in sight. The waters were being shaken by the strong winds and the rain. I figured they must be ice cold. I realized that I wasn't exactly being very tactile, for all I knew, Ruggiero could be miles from where I was. But then again, I didn't have much information to go by. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, trying to figure out what I was doing. I felt stupid, somehow. Self-doubt seemed to overwhelm me. Was I really in a position to catch a serial vampire? Yet, here I was. That's when I saw something that caught my eye. It washed up on the shores of the Neva, almost as though it were signaling me. I squinted, trying to figure out what it was. It glinted, then I realized that it was a bottle. I walked over to it, wondering if it would do me any good. Picking it up, I looked into its glass. You guessed it. There was a piece of paper in it. Pulling out the cork, I shook the bottle several times, until the piece of paper came out. It fell onto the river bank. I bent down and picked it up. Opening it, I read the hand-scribbled message. Kaine. What I have for you here is a riddle. A feast of flesh is a gift from God. But what happens when the hunter becomes the hunted? Best regards. Ruggiero. I considered what he might mean for a few seconds. I soon figured out the riddle. It was simple, I was the hunter, yet I was now his next target. But I still didn't know what he meant regarding a feast of flesh being a gift from God. Could this serial vampire be a Christian? Did he think he was somehow working for God? One word hit my mind: deranged. This Ruggiero was insane. And I was next on his list. I suddenly looked around, my instincts kicking in. This madman might pounce out of nowhere. I then realized that this wasn't going to be easy. I needed to gather my bearings. I decided to comb the banks of the river, looking for any more telltale signs. That was the best I could do for now. Naturally, I found nothing else. Here I was, feeling miserable, walking down a lonely river bank. My life was awful, all I had was Jez. I couldn't get a decent night's sleep without having nightmares. Each day I felt burnt out, to be perfectly blunt, I felt like a loser. How ironic was that? The Messiah, yet a loser. That's when I heard Jez's voice in my head. Let go, Mike, just let go. I started to feel better again. I knew why. Jez was my salvation, without her, I'd probably have committed suicide. Feeling like a child, I walked back to the hotel. Back to Jez. 6. When Jez opened the door to our hotel room, I practically fell into her arms. I felt strange. I felt like I might throw up. Jez held on to me fiercely, guiding me towards the bed. My God, Mike, what's happened to you? I don't know, babe. I was at the river. I was about to start hunting for Ruggiero. I found this note, next thing I know, I started feeling weak, like I was about to faint. Jez laid me down gently on the bed. All right, she said. I'm just gonna get you a glass of water. If you don't start feeling better, we'll take you to a doctor. Okay, hon. I nodded slightly. Jez came back in a few seconds with a cold glass of water. I drank it down gingerly, then gave the glass back to Jez. I then laid my head back on the bed and closed my eyes. As Jez stroked my hair, I slowly started to fall asleep. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. When I woke up, there was someone else in the hotel room. I guessed it was a doctor. He was seated on the side of the bed. He had a kind face. How are you feeling, my friend? He asked. I groaned. Better, I guess. I feel really worn out, though. You seem to be in good condition generally. I checked your heartbeat and breathing. Things seem normal. But I did notice that you're quite stressed. Would you like to talk about it? Have you thought about counseling? I shook my head. No, no. I don't think I need anything like that. But yes. I have been quite stressed lately. I think that maybe I just need to take things easy for a while. The doctor nodded. Understandable, my friend. Russia is a good place to unwind. But try to avoid the overly busy areas. Nodding, I grinned. That's for sure. Thanks. I'll definitely be taking your advice. The doctor glanced at Jez, then looked back at me, smiled. I hope you make a smooth recovery, Mr. Fury. I shall be going now. Jez walked up to the door with the doctor and, thanking him, saw him leave. She then walked back to the bed and sat down beside me. She still looked very concerned. I couldn't help but feel my heart melt. Jez was so amazing. Her eyes showed so much caring that I felt a lump in my throat. She spoke, bringing me out of my daydreaming. I think we'd better do as the doctor suggested. Han, are you up for a stroll around the city? I shrugged my shoulders, then tilted my head to the side. Yeah. I suppose. But let's not go where there's too many crowds, okay? She leaned forward and kissed me on the cheek. Sure. I guess we could take a stroll down the Nevsky River. I raised my eyebrows. Aren't you forgetting something? That freak is still out there, supposedly in that particular area. Jez winced. Oh my God, that's right. I totally forgot. She then grinned sheepishly. I couldn't help but smile. Why don't we just take a small tour, on foot? Sounds good to me. I'll go get ready. Back in a jiffy. She quickly gave me another kiss, this time on the lips, then got up and hurriedly walked into the bathroom. 5 minutes later, we left our hotel room and took a taxi to the Nevsky Prospect. We'd had the good judgment to wear warm clothing, the winds were just as strong as when I'd been at the Neva River. We walked up and down the prospect just enjoying the sights. Unfortunately, while there, I started to feel a little jittery again. Jez caught on quickly, and suggested that we go and see the Winter Palace. We enjoyed the artwork displayed in the State Heritage Museum. I couldn't help but be impressed. The various paintings were magnificent. The works of world art included everything from ancient Egyptian to the French Impressionists. Jez was obviously having a great time, and was glad to see that I seemed to have more or less recovered from my little episode of nausea. She hung on to my shoulder and pointed admiringly at paintings which caught her eye. Suddenly, a shrill scream echoed throughout the large gallery. This was followed by shouts in Russian from apparently the same female. Our heads spun round, and Jez and I, along with dozens of other spectators, dropped our jaws. The woman who had screamed now lay on the floor, convulsed with spasms, while a fiendish creature tore at her neck, biting off chunks of flesh, spraying a nearby security guard crimson from the lapels of his uniform to his shoes. He shouted something in Russian, which I presumed was something along the lines of "Alert all guards." I didn't hesitate. "Take cover, Jez," I shouted over the din caused by the now panic-stricken crowd, and ran straight towards whom I guessed had to be none other than Ruggiero himself. 7. As if sensing my approach, the barbaric vampire looked up quickly, his eyes showing pure fever. The woman at his knees was now obviously dead. It was too late for her, but maybe not for any of his victims to be. I leaped high, my hands thrust outwards. The impact sent Ruggiero flipping backwards, slamming the ground with enough force to make him let out an oomph. In a fraction of a second, I found myself thinking how difficult it was to believe that this was the creature who'd sent me that riddle previously. He seemed so animalistic. He now snarled, bearing huge fangs which dripped with crimson saliva that had a metallic smell to it. This was a smell I was familiar with, of course. "Bad move, Mr. Ruggiero," I breathed, then slammed his jaw with my elbow. The force of the blow made his head snap sideways. He bellowed with rage. "I guess you don't like seafood, hey?" I cracked. For a fraction of a second, he looked at me as if implying that I'd lost my mind, then let out another cry of rage. This guy meant business. I got to my feet quickly, holding on to the collar of Ruggiero's coat. We now stood face to face, me still clutching the fiend's coat, and Ruggiero now holding my wrists, trying to pry my hands away. I acted quickly. Letting go of his coat and squirming out of the grip he had on my wrists, I swiftly delivered 2 continuous blows to his nose, smashing it. Blood flew out, but missed my face. He once again bellowed, sounding humiliated and really pissed off. Grabbing his throat, I quickly looked around. Not that many people seemed to be around. Most of the spectators had fled, looking for safety, and only about 15, maybe 20, people seemed to be watching me and the freak struggle. A couple of replacement security guards were present, but seemed to be clueless as to what they could do to help. They just watched on, almost as though they were fascinated. Still holding the maniac's throat, I considered the situation. Better think of something fast. Then it hit me. Bingo! On display in the museum were several varieties of historical firearms. The ones that caught my eye were a bunch of those 19th century muskets. Although their spikes were metal, they could very well incapacitate Ruggiero if he were stabbed cleanly. It wouldn't kill him, but it would certainly put him out of action. I didn't waste any more time. I glanced over my shoulder at one of the security guards. "Quick!" I shouted. "Get me one of those guns." The security guard exchanged glances with his colleague, swallowed, then looked back at me as if dumbfounded. He shook his head helplessly, then spoke in a whiny voice. "But sir, these guns are very valuable, they are a part of history." I grimaced. "Look, I'm not going to be able to hold this monster back much longer. He's going to kill more people unless you hurry and get me one of those muskets." The security guard hesitated, then nodded quickly. He then turned away and ran for one of the glass display boxes which contained the larger of the weapons. He smashed the glass with his baton, then took out a beautiful Civil War relic, one that would probably cost a fortune today. The security guard turned swiftly and then, after hesitating once more for maybe a fraction of a second, tossed the weapon to me. Still keeping my grip on Ruggiero's throat with my right hand, I caught the weapon with the other. Ruggiero was now struggling ferociously, trying to pry my hand away from his throat. Without wasting another second, I stabbed him in the stomach with the metal point of the musket. He cried out, but didn't seem to be too concerned. If only I'd brought a stake with me. Damn! Suddenly, on a wild whim, I stabbed him repeatedly in the chest, at least 10 times. Wild screams escaped from him, strangely echoing through the now mostly deserted showroom. Fortunately, this made him weaker, and he started to slump against me, seemingly drained of energy. I stepped back, and he fell onto the floor, smacking the marble beneath our feet. He let out a few moans, then just lay there, seemingly unconscious. A pool of blood started to gather around his body, almost black. It reminded me of what blood looked like in certain horror films. Of course, if I'd stabbed the bastard with a stake, he'd be dead by now. I was powerless to do anything more about him, without a stake. They didn't call vampires immortal for nothing. I looked over my shoulder to see several security guards approaching me, their batons ready in case my friend at my feet decided on seconds. I quickly turned my eyes back to Ruggiero, and kept a close watch on him. The security guard who led his colleagues came up to me and spoke urgently. "What is your business here, comrade? Are you with the embassy? Do you work undercover?" I replied urgently. "Actually, I work for an independent task force. I'm not able to supply any details, but I can guarantee that I can get rid of this menace for you, once and for all." I kicked Ruggiero's side, making him release a growl. For a few seconds, the guard eyed me suspiciously. Then his expression turned to one of more understanding. He nodded. "Thank you, comrade. I'm sure you have saved many lives. What will you do with this man?" He frowned. "This is a man, yes. Let's just say he's a biological oddity. Leave it to me." I then came up with more crap to tell this inquisitive guard. "This maniac is wanted overseas. I'll make sure he's delivered myself." The guard nodded once more, now looking genuinely relieved. "I thank you, comrade. And I am sure the embassy will be most grateful. Is there anything me or my comrades can do to help?" I kicked Ruggiero's side again. "He'll need a body bag. Asterisk asterisk asterisk." Later, Jez and I held each other near a corner of the showroom. She was obviously very relieved that I'd gotten through the ordeal without a scratch. "It's not over, babe. Ruggiero isn't actually dead. All I did was stab in the stomach several times with the front end of a musket. He needs to be turned into ash, with a stake." Jez looked concerned. "How will you finish him off if they take him away?" I told the security guard that I was working undercover. The way I took care of that freak convinced him. So I got him to tell me where they'd most likely be taking Ruggiero. Jez frowned. "Where's that?" "The local morgue." 8. Back in our hotel room, I made a quick phone call to Father Sanchez. After 3 rings, he picked up. "Yes. Hi, Father, it's me, Kaine." "Ah, Señor Kaine. You have good news for me, yes." "Well, sort of. I managed to incapacitate Ruggiero. But he's not out yet." There was a short silence. "Meaning what, Señor?" Managing to hold back a laugh, I said, "What I mean is, I stabbed him several times, but not with a stake. I used a sharp instrument. He's out cold. He's being taken to the local morgue." On the other side of the line, I heard Father Sanchez sigh. "This is not good, Señor. You normally finish the job I assign to you, yes. I know, Father. I'm sorry. The thing is, I hesitated. I had some trouble earlier today. I was at the Nevsky River, about to try and hunt down Ruggiero. But I started feeling nauseous and had to go back to my hotel room. Also, when I was at the river, I found a note. It was signed Ruggiero, but I'm not sure anymore. I don't think it could have. I agree, Señor. Ruggiero would be too much of an animal to have sent you a note, yes. Exactly what I was thinking. What did this note say? Let me try and remember. Silence. That's right, I continued. It said something like what happens when the hunter becomes the prey. More silence. Then, this is not good at all, Señor. In fact, I have an idea who might have sent you this note. Who? Father Sanchez cleared his throat. I think it might have been from Dhrovu himself, my son. I thought carefully about what Father Sanchez had just said. You might be right, Father. As I've said before, everything goes according to the prophecy, Señor. When the time comes, you will know more. One other thing. What? For her own protection, I think you should try to leave your lady friend out of your business as much as possible. I agree, though she can be difficult to leave behind sometimes. She's always insisting on coming along. In fact, I'd probably be in deeper shit if it wasn't for her. Your language, Señor. I cleared my throat. I'm sorry, Father. Like I said, I'm not really 100% right now. I understand, my son. But you'll finish Ruggiero, yes. I guarantee it, Father. Very well, my son. I shall leave you to it. Bye for now, Father. Take care of yourself, Señor. I hung up the phone, then turned to Jez. She looked into my eyes, still showing concern. Listen, I said. I'm gonna have to go to the local morgue and finish off that animal. But you're not well, sweetie. I know, babe. Look, I think I know what we need to do. Don't tell me, she rolled her eyes up teasingly, as if in thought for a few moments. Pandora. I couldn't help but grin. How'd you guess? Women's intuition, hon. As if I had to ask. But you're right. I think I'm definitely gonna need her help. Jez nodded. But we'll have to go see Jennifer first, won't we? Yeah, the old mirror trick. Which means we can't summon her here. Right. It won't be a piece of cake, but I'm pretty sure I can manage to get rid of Ruggiero even in this condition. I suppose you do look better than when we brought in the doctor. Yeah. It's weird. I feel like I need to throw up, or something. Well, take it easy for now. We can head back home tomorrow if you finish the job tonight. Yeah. I'm gonna get some sleep now, okay? Okay, hon. She kissed me tenderly. 9. I woke up around 10:30. Jez was sound asleep. I got out of bed quietly, put on my shoes and jacket, then left the room stealthily. The lobby was mostly deserted as I exited the hotel. Outside, I quickly checked my map of the area. I'd have to catch a taxi to get to the suburb where the morgue was. There were several parked along the curb. I selected one randomly, then opened its rear door and climbed in. The driver looked over his shoulder. Where to, mister? Just downtown, I said. The driver pulled away from the curb and started driving. We were both silent as he covered the area between the hotel and the southern suburbs. Arriving at my destination, I paid and got out of the cab. As the cabbie drove away, I looked around. There were trees on both sides of the road, which would provide some cover for me while I walked the few miles to the morgue. I needed the foliage as I wasn't thinking straight. In fact, I was already having doubts about carrying out the mission. My nauseousness had increased. But Father Sanchez would never forgive me if I failed. I steeled my mind, then walked into the woods on the east side of the road. The hike took me about 20 minutes. I then walked out of the woods and found myself in a more residential area. I checked the map again. The morgue would be a few blocks down. I walked the distance at a fair pace and found myself at an alley east of the large building housing the morgue. The rest was fairly straightforward, all I had to do was break a window and enter through it. I walked cautiously down the length of the building, keeping a lookout for a window large enough. Spotting one halfway down the alley, I stopped and looked around. No one in sight. There were a couple of trash bins nearby. They'd provide perfect leverage. I walked up to them. Only one had a lid. I looked back at the window over my shoulder. It would take some effort, but I figured I should be able to reach high enough, if I stood on the bin and stretched myself. I carried the bin with the lid up to the area directly below the window, then clambered onto it. I then reached beneath my jacket and pulled out a stake. Then reaching high, I smashed the window. The noise made me cringe. Hopefully, no one had heard it. I then broke the jagged bits of glass on the lower frame, once again using the stake. Then, once again reaching high, I threw the stake through the window. I heard it thunk inside the building. I waited a few minutes, listening intently, in case someone might have heard it. But no sounds followed. Satisfied, I reached upwards and gripped the lower frame of the window firmly. Then, as quietly as possible, I lifted myself upwards, pulling at the frame. My heels scooted against the wall as I pushed myself inside through the window's opening. Then, turning as I descended, I lowered myself cautiously down to the morgue's floor. I studied my surroundings. I seemed to be in some kind of storeroom. There were all kinds of autopsy instruments inside. I tried to gather my thoughts, which wasn't easy due to my nauseousness. I took a few deep breaths, and felt slightly better. The exertion of pulling myself up to the window and lowering myself inside the building had warmed me up some, which was helpful due to the night's chill. I now walked silently up to the room's door and tried its handle, not locked. Opening the door, I stepped out of the storeroom as quietly as possible. I found myself in a passageway, with doors along each side. All of them were shut. I figured I'd have to try each one, just to find the mausoleum. Trying each door, I came to a dead end each time. They were either storerooms or autopsy rooms. Some actually had bodies lying on examination tables, all dead. Some of the bodies were cut open and nauseating to look at. Eventually, though, I came upon a room which had nothing but body bags in it, body bags with bodies inside them. I took a deep breath, then walked inside. There were countless rows of body bags, all zipped up. I wouldn't have had a clue which bag Ruggiero was in if not for one giveaway. The top of one of the bags had a large protrusion where the body's chest would have been. Of course. The musket. This saved me a lot of precious time. I quickly, and maybe a little recklessly, considering the state I was in, walked over to that particular bag, and drew out a stake from beneath my jacket. Then, cautiously, I started unzipping the bag, slowly, revealing first Ruggiero's hideous face, and then the musket, which was still jammed in his chest. This was when the fun began. One of the animal's eyes opened. It showed instant recognition. A corner of his mouth moved, revealing a disgusting fang. He growled. If he could talk, I think he would have said something along the lines of "I still don't like you. In fact, I think you're full of shit." I wiggled my eyebrows. "I'm back." Ruggiero snarled, then suddenly started struggling with the musket, trying to pull it out. Unfortunately, just as I was about to attack him, he reached out with his other arm and smashed the side of my neck. The blow had a great deal of strength, and sent me slamming against a table on which was another body. While I was still recovering from the blow, Ruggiero proceeded to pull the musket out of his chest, after a few tries. The spike's tip shone bright red, even in the poorly lighted mausoleum. Unfortunately, I didn't have much time to react. Without warning, Ruggiero struggled out of the body bag swiftly and stood up, once again snarling. He locked his furious eyes on me. He was now running straight at me. I didn't have time to reach for a stake, so I just got up and started running out of the mausoleum. I heard the psychotic vampire's footsteps right behind me. He sounded like he was gaining on me. I ran faster, down the passageway, past door after door. Then, without warning, I opened a door that had a sign on it saying Examination Room Number 5. I quickly ran inside, hoping the crazy fool would run past it. Unfortunately, he didn't. I heard him enter behind me, roaring furiously. The room we were in had several autopsy tables. Behind the furthest was a table on which were several autopsy tools, saws, scissors, drills, scalpels. I quickly ran towards the tool table and grabbed a huge scalpel, and I mean huge. I heard Ruggiero stomp closer and closer behind me. I could hear him snarling. I didn't hesitate. With one smooth move, I spun around, the scalpel held at an arm's length away from me. Blood splattered my face and neck. The scalpel tore through Ruggiero's neck, making a ripping sound which would have made you cringe. I focused. The gory stump of his neck spurted blood like a hose. His hands moved about wildly, grasping nothing but air, as though he were trying to locate his head. His head, in fact, was now a good distance away from us, on the floor. But Ruggiero wasn't out yet. He moved about clumsily, reminding me of the headless horseman in Sleepy Hollow. He crashed into table after table, still clawing at nothing but thin air. I couldn't believe the crazy fool was still alive. I knew what I had to do. Reaching behind my jacket, I grabbed a stake. I bounced it a couple of times in my hand, then took aim and threw it. It flew cleanly through the air, making a swooshing sound. It punctured the area just barely to the right of Ruggiero's left shoulder blade, and went in cleanly. I had no doubts that it would have pierced his heart. He stood still for a couple of seconds, then gripped each end of the stake with his hands, as if unsure which side to pull it out from. But he was too late. His arms dropped weakly to his sides. He then fell forwards with a loud thunk, caused by the point of the stake, no doubt. The back end of the stake pushed outwards maybe a couple of inches. Ruggiero now lay still, obviously dead. I kept my eyes on him for a few moments. It was interesting how some vampires turned to ash and some didn't. Maybe I'd find out why, someday. I held up the scalpel I'd just used as a weapon, most of it was bright crimson. I let out a sigh. Phew. 10. Half an hour later, back in my hotel room, I spun my bizarre little tale to Jez. She listened intently, trying not to burst out laughing every now and then. You know what? What? You're one lucky guy, Mike. I mean. God. Look at how you never get seriously hurt. The angels are definitely on your side, you know what I mean. I guess that's one way of putting it, I said, lying back on the bed, my feet on the floor. Jez loomed over me, straddling me playfully. So, what's next on the agenda? I shook my head. I don't know, babe. I'm still not feeling 100%. Feel like I've had too much seafood or something. Jez pouted. You know what? What? Let's see what Father Sanchez has to say. Besides, I need to let him know I succeeded with the mission, anyway. Okie dokas. I'll go make us some tea. Thanks, babe. I picked up my cell phone. Father Sanchez answered on the fourth ring. Hello. Yes. Kaine. How did it go? A little rough, but I got the bastard. You are certain that you killed him? What did I just say? Yes. Well done, my son. No need to be sarcastic, yes. Sorry, father. It's been a rough night. Yes, Señor, of course. Are you feeling any better, generally? Afraid not, father. I'm still feeling pretty nauseous. Señor. I think I may know the remedy. Really? What would that be? It's fairly straightforward, Señor. I've got a spiritual healer working undercover in Berlin. In Berlin? That is correct. Her name is Helena, a beautiful young lady. I'm sure you'll get along very well with her, Señor. No kidding? And you think she might be able to fix me up? Exactly, Señor. He was silent for a moment. Then, you see, Kaine, as we agreed previously, Dhrovu may have been responsible for your illness. He is essentially a manifestation of fear, my son. He draws his power from it, and he may very well have placed a seed of fear within you. This is why I think you need therapy, Señor. Helena is a true professional, and her hands can practically cause miracles. Also, she has the heart of an angel. I cleared my throat. Okay. How do I get there? 11. The Lufthansa flight from Russia to Berlin went fairly smoothly, and I didn't really feel airsick. I still felt pretty wobbly, though. We disembarked and went through 45 minutes of customs at Schönefeld Airport. From there, we took a bus to southwestern Berlin. The scenery was beautiful, to say the least. We passed several hills and forests, all lush green. It was late afternoon by the time we arrived at Helena's villa, in the suburb of Dahlem. The bus was driven away after we disembarked, carrying several tourists. We stood there for a while, looking up at the beautiful villa, shaking our heads in admiration. Wow, said Jez, how beautiful is that, hey? I nodded. Yeah. Can't wait to meet Helena. I bet. We walked up the steps, carrying our suitcases, and stood under the roof-like structure of the porch. I rang the bell. Chimes could be heard inside, followed by quick footsteps. Just a minute, came a female voice, in a thick German accent. Jez and I looked at each other, slightly amused. I wiggled my eyebrows. Jez shook her head. The door opened, and there stood a beautiful brunette in a short brown sundress. She smiled warmly. Hello. I smiled back. Hey. I'm Mike, this is Jez. The young lady nodded. Glad you could make it before it got dark. I'm Helena, as you both might have guessed. I nodded. Yeah. I take it you know Father Sanchez, who I pretty much work for. Of course. Trust me, he sent you to the right person to see. Come on in. We picked up our suitcases and entered. We then followed Helena into what appeared to be her den. It was large and spacious, with easy chairs and couches placed at stylish angles. Definitely into feng shui, I thought. Please, she said. Be seated. Oh, and just leave your suitcases here for now. I'll show you to your rooms shortly. We did so, and settled into a couple of comfy settees close to each other. What would you like for a drink, tea or coffee? Tea would be great, thanks, said Jez. I nodded. The same, thanks. She smiled warmly, and walked out of the den. As we waited for her to return, we looked around. A large widescreen television hung on the wall, above the fireplace. Surround speakers were placed at broad angles, suggesting a very theatrical sound experience. Jez seemed to be admiring her home theater setup too. Some place, hey, she said, also glancing at the various paintings hanging on the walls, and pieces of china placed here and there. I nodded. Yeah. I bet she's loaded. Helena soon reappeared, carrying a tray. It held a pot of tea, a couple of containers and 2 white china cups, as well as some biscuits. She placed the tray on the coffee table. Please help yourselves, she said, then sat down herself, on an easy chair opposite Jez and I. After we'd poured ourselves cups of tea, both taking milk and sugar, we settled back, still tired from the long bus ride. So, began Helena, I hear you need a little healing, Mike. Yeah, I said. I'm not feeling too good, my legs feel weak, and I feel kind of faint. A bit like you need to throw up, asked Helena, grinning. Jez and I couldn't help but laugh. Exactly, I managed through my laughter. Well, don't you worry, buddy. I'll have you back in shape in no time. Thanks, I said, leaning back comfortably on the settee. You've got a really nice place here. Do you live alone? Helena nodded. That's right. My health club is housed within this villa. I also teach physiotherapy at the Frey Universitat nearby. It's a good job. Neat, said Jez. So how did you get to know Father Sanchez? Well, Helena said, her eyes looking upwards, as if reflecting her past, it's a long story. My ex-boyfriend became a priest around 2001, and Father Sanchez, who was on business here around that time, took him under his wing. He's good friends with Father Sanchez to this day, and they're both always in touch with me. Later on, Father Sanchez recruited me, as he wanted someone who was truly gifted at healing to work for him. As you can see, it's paid off. You'll be back in shape in no time, Kaine. Mike, I said, a little taken by this beautiful girl. Call me Mike. I grinned. Only my enemies call me Kaine, mostly, anyway. Helena grinned back, obviously aware of my attraction to her. Mike, of course. Jez cleared her throat, and I almost jumped back into right there and then. Helena eyed her for a moment, which could have well been only a fraction of a second. I then cleared my throat, trying to ease the tension I suddenly felt. Now then, Helena said, shall I show you to your rooms? That'd be great, said Jez, sounding a little harsh. No problem, said Helena, a little more on guard now. Please take your luggage and come this way. Jez and I picked up our suitcases and followed Helena down a hallway. We passed maybe 3 bedrooms, then followed our hostess into a large, elegant bedroom with a queen-size bed. There were fresh flowers in a vase next to the bed, and the off-white curtains let in muted daylight. We put down our suitcases and looked around the room, admiring it. Please make yourselves comfortable, you two. Mike, I'll get started on fixing you up tomorrow. How does that sound? Helena smiled warmly. Sounds good to me, I said, glancing at Jez and raising my eyebrows. Jez nodded and smiled, looking tired. All right. Get some rest, you two. And feel free to look around the garden later on, if you feel like it. I'll let you know when dinner's ready. With that Helena smiled once more, then walked out the door. 12. Jez and I exchanged glances, and I wiggled my eyebrows. Jez pouted. What? Nothing. Jez poked her tongue out at me. I had an idea what might have been on her mind, but knew better than to say anything. I walked up to the bed and dropped backwards onto it, then sighed. Jez walked up to the window and pushed aside the curtains on the left. My God, she said. What a gorgeous garden. She looked over her shoulder. You up for a walk, sweetie? Sure, I said. Can we go in like 5 minutes? Jez beamed. No problem. As I lay there, feeling considerably relaxed, I suddenly noticed a sharp pain on my back, where my shoulder blades were. I grimaced, then raised myself slightly off the bed and reached behind my back. I gently kneaded the flesh behind each shoulder blade. I felt slight lines there, similar to those of a healing scratch. I frowned, wondering where they could have come from. Jez was still looking out of the window, and didn't notice me feeling my back. Deciding it probably wasn't anything serious, I got up. Hey babe, let's go check out Helena's garden. Jez turned away from the window and grinned. Great. We left our bedroom and walked up the hallway to the den. Entering the den, we opened the sliding door at the rear and let ourselves out. There was a patio outside, which reached out towards the edge of a large swimming pool. We made our way around the pool towards the lawn on the far end. From there, we walked down a footpath to the main gardens. Jez and I exchanged glances. The garden was breathtaking, to say the least. A large variety of flowers made up the main part of the garden. A variety of roses, daffodils, tulips, and carnations bloomed, smelling fresh and pure. The way they were arranged was very impressive. Some were on ordinary flower beds, while others hung in pots which were suspended inside sheltering structures. "Know what we should do?" said Jez. "We should buy ourselves a really big house, then set up a garden like this one." I nodded. "Not a bad idea at all." I then grinned. "Of course, I'll have to ask Father Sanchez for a raise." Jez laughed. "Oh, there you are, you two." We turned our heads. It was Helena. Jez and I smiled in unison. "I was just looking for you to let you know that supper will be ready in 10 minutes. "Thanks," I said. "We were just admiring your garden, it's beautiful." Helena smiled. "Why, thank you. I do work very hard on it." Jez and I exchanged glances. "You mean you don't have anyone else working on it?" Helena shook her head. "No. I'm a professional." "Amazing," said Jez. Helena smiled modestly. My eyes traveled further, away from the garden's borders, and fixed on what appeared to be a lush forest, not too far away. Jez walked up to my side, and also peered towards the foliage. "That's the eternal forest," said Helena. "I'll tell you two all about it over dinner." ******. Supper was more like a banquet. I could have sworn we'd just entered the era of King Arthur. There was beautiful German homemade bread, butter, cottage cheese, a large roast, jugs of milk, I'm not kidding, and fresh fruit. We had ourselves a grand old meal, while Helena told us all about the eternal forest. "My friend Frida lives there," she said, as if telling a couple of kids a fairy tale. "She lives there with her band of merry women." Jez and I listened to this tall tale with more than just curiosity. "Unfortunately, they aren't the only ones who live there." Helena widened her eyes. "The evil vampire Thorn lives there too, with his army of mercenaries." "How do Frida and her friends evade Thorn?" I asked, munching on a piece of cheese. "Good question," said Helena. "Frida is a vampire hunter herself." Winking, she said, "You and her are likely to get on very well with each other." Jez looked surprised. "My God, a female vampire hunter, right here in Germany?" Helena nodded, her eyes wide as though she were regarding a child. "She's the best there is, next to Mike, of course." A corner of my mouth curved upwards. "Of course." Jez threw a piece of cheese at me, scowling. "So the two bands are practically at war?" I asked, hooked on this almost surreal tale. "Exactly," Helena said. "Then, would you like to meet Frida and her band?" Jez and I exchanged glances, then returned our eyes to Helena. "Why not?" I said. "Great," said Helena. "I'll take the two of you over tomorrow." 13. The next day was a quiet one. In the morning, after a delicious breakfast, Helena asked me to come over to her therapy quarters for a checkup. Wearing a pair of shorts and a t-shirt, I entered the sweetly scented therapy room. Helena was busy comparing a chart with scribblings on a sheet of paper. On a nearby table was a portable radio/CD/cassette recorder. "When You're Looking Like That" by Westlife could be heard from its speakers. Helena looked over her shoulder. "Oh, hey Mike, just sit over on that bed there. I'll be with you in a second." I nodded, then walked over to the therapy bed and pushed myself onto it. Looking around, I couldn't help but admire Helena's workplace. There were 3 certificates on the walls. On the floor were some weighing scales, and numerous other medical contraptions were in the room. On a shelf were several books on medicine and aromatherapy. Laying down the chart, Helena walked up to the therapy bed. Okay, she began. Just lie back, Mike. I'm just going to do some routine checks. I was now lying on the bed, while Helena checked my temperature, my pulse, and heartbeat. Everything seems to be fine generally, Helena said. You do seem a little stressed though, also, your breathing seems to be a little jolty. Take your shirt off, will you, Mike? I sat up and removed my t-shirt. Now just lie back, Mike. I did as she said. Helena felt my chest and stomach gently. Are any of these areas sore? I winced a little. Just over there, it's a little sore. She took her hand away from my side. Okay. Could you turn over, Mike? I did as she said. I'd been waiting, lying on my stomach for maybe 5 seconds, when I thought I heard Helena gasp. I turned my head around, trying to see over my shoulder. Where did you get these marks? Hey? What marks? On your shoulder blades, you've got 2 distinct lines, they're bleeding slightly. I suddenly remembered about how the skin over my shoulder blades had felt sore. I'm not sure how that happened. Is it serious? I don't think so. Hang on a second, I'll put something on them. Helena walked away from the bed and over to the counter. There, she opened a drawer and took out a small bottle. She walked back over to me. I noticed that she also held a small bag of cotton wool. I'm going to put some antiseptic on it, then bandage it. If they don't heal soon, you'll have to do something serious about them. Finished with applying the antiseptic, she patched up the wounds with gauze pads. We'll start with relaxation tomorrow. That's pretty much all for today. Help yourself to tea or coffee, okay? Helena smiled warmly. I smiled back. No problem. Are you sure Father Sanchez wouldn't mind me not paying? She nodded. No charge for someone as important as you. Helena then grinned. 14. Later on, as I made myself a cup of tea in the kitchen, Jez sneaked up behind me and kissed me quickly on the cheek. Geez. I said. You almost made me drop my cup. Oops. Sorry, hon, could you make me a cup too? Sure. A couple of minutes later, holding our cups of tea, we walked into the den. I snatched the remote from the coffee table before Jez could get her hands on it, and switched on the television. A music video channel came on. David Hasselhoff was singing "I've Been Looking for Freedom." I flicked through the channels until I found a movie channel. An old Christopher Lee Dracula film was on, dubbed in German. Leave it on that, said Jez, and I did so, gladly. I then settled on the couch, Jez snuggled up to me. We sipped our teas contently, our eyes glued to Helena's large widescreen television. We'd been watching the movie for maybe half an hour, when Helena came into the den. Hey, you two, in the mood for a trip to the eternal forest? We looked up. Sure, said Jez. Sounds good to me, I said. Great, said Helena. Just make sure you don't carry any weapons with you, Mike. Frida and her girls might not be very pleased. No problem. Let's go. As we walked down Helena's front door steps, I checked the time. It was just after 11 a.m. The sun was shining brightly, birds singing loudly. The walk to the forest was a pleasant one. We went along the east side of Helena's yard. The dark hedges blocked any view of her villa, except for the upper floor. The path was shaded by large trees, most of them were oak trees. I looked at Jez, whose behavior somehow reminded me of a child. She was so beautiful and vivacious. Memories of how we'd met started flooding back into my mind. I remembered the strange dream we'd both had. Thank God for Jez. We were now on what appeared to be a back road. It was dusty and a little less secluded, there weren't as many trees as before. We walked along this trail for maybe 20 minutes, then came across a turnstile, on which was carved the following message. The Eternal Forest. 500 kilometers ahead. From where the turnstile was, we turned into another trail, with slightly more foliage than the previous one. We walked down the trail tirelessly, with much anticipation. Helena had brought along a water bottle, which all three of us took swigs from occasionally. Finally, we came across what appeared to be a footpath leading into dense foliage. "Ah, here we are," said Helena. "This is the southern entry to the enchanted forest." "You mean there's another entrance?" I asked. Helena nodded, her face flushed. "The other one is used by Thorn and his mercenaries." Then, wiping her brow, she added, "We'd have to be crazy to try to enter from that side." Jez and I looked at each other and shrugged, almost in sync. We then followed Helena into the dense forest. The forest was fairly quiet, except for the occasional titter of a bird. The sun was mostly blocked by the tall trees, leaving the atmosphere fairly cool. We were relieved about this, as it had been a hot and humid hike. We looked around, enjoying the shade provided by the trees. Jez and I turned to Helena in surprise when she made a strange sound. It was a cry like one would expect from a strange bird, high-pitched and loud enough to be heard from a fair distance. As Jez and I looked on, the strange call was returned from somewhere deep within the forest. The voice was definitely female. Helena looked at us and grinned. "That would be Frida, she's on her way." 15. We were kept waiting for no more than maybe 2 minutes. Then, right out of the foliage above us burst a woman with extraordinary acrobatic skills. She swung cleanly onto the top of a nearby birch tree, then somersaulted down gracefully, agile and cat-like. She landed smoothly on the leafy ground, just a few feet away from us. I felt like my breath had just been taken away. To say that this woman was beautiful would have to be an understatement. Her blonde hair was done in braids, and she wore a very skimpy outfit, made mostly of leather. In fact, she was almost naked. 2 thin leather straps reached from just above her waist to her firm round breasts, only just covering the nipples. A tiny leather pouch covered her pubic area. She wore black leather boots which reached just above her knees. "Greetings," she now said, with a thick German accent. "I'm Frida, vampire hunter and comrade of Helena. Welcome to my domain." She nodded hospitably, glancing from me to Jez. Still a little breathless, I said, "Hello. I'm Mike." "I'm Jez." Having said that, Jez gave me a slight kick on my shin. Helena smiled knowingly. "These two are staying with me for a week or so. They're from America." "America? What a wonderful surprise for me and the band. Please, come this way." With that, Frida turned around and started walking deeper into the forest. I noticed how she only had the thinnest of leather thongs going along the seam of her buttocks, leaving her backside almost completely bare. As we followed, I couldn't help but grin at the way her plump, round buttocks moved with each stride she took. Maybe 10 minutes later, we entered a large clearing, where several large, canvas tents had been put up. Several young maidens were present, some preparing food on pans held over campfires, others sitting around and chatting, some were busy whittling wooden posts with knives. It didn't take a genius to guess what they were for. As we walked further into the clearing, some of the maidens looked up from what they were doing. Others stopped their chores and walked over to greet us. "Hey everyone," shouted one particularly attractive young maiden, "it's Helena." She walked over to greet us, followed by several of her comrades. Most of the maidens were dressed in very similar fashion to Frida. "Hello, everyone," shouted Helena. "Andrea," she said, obviously referring to the one who'd spoken first, "so good to see you again." "My, don't you look wonderful?" She embraced Andrea. Several of the others followed suit. "Helena's brought some friends over," said Frida. "Well, Helena? Are you going to introduce us?" "This is Mike and Jez," said Helena, gesturing towards me and Jez. "Actually, Mike also goes by another name." Helena grinned mischievously. His enemies call him Kaine. Suddenly silence filled the clearing, only the birds continued to titter. The maidens now looked a little shocked, some of them talked to each other in hushed voices. All their eyes were on me now. Frida in particular looked a little stunned. My God, she almost whispered, unable to tear her eyes away from me. So the legend is true, she dropped to one knee humbly. Welcome, Lord Kaine. We are most honored. A little lost for words, I said thank you. It's a pleasure to meet you all. I looked around me. Every single one of the maidens was kneeling on one knee now. I could tell that Jez was feeling a little stunned, too. I'm sorry, Helena almost whispered. Maybe I should have warned you. To them, you're practically God. It's okay, I said in a hushed voice. It comes with the job. Please, said Frida. Come this way. We followed her to one of the tents. Ducking and entering it, she beckoned with her left hand. We followed suit. The inside of the tent was surprisingly spacious. In a corner was a Coleman lantern, a flame flickered inside it, throwing a fair amount of light onto the tent's interior. Please be seated, said Frida, then gestured towards a row of cushions, each of which was covered with a colorful silk-like material. We sat down, and Frida also seated herself, facing us. How have you been, Helena? She said. Good, said Helena. There really hasn't been much happening. I've been busy with my clinic. It's good to get some company every now and then. I can imagine, said Frida. We've missed you dearly, especially Andrea. How sweet, Helena said. I'm so sorry I haven't visited you more recently. Mike is my top priority at the moment. His mentor has asked me to give him some special treatment, he needs some spiritual healing. Frida looked at me and Jez, then smiled reassuringly. You couldn't have found a better healer, Mike, or should I call you Kaine? I smiled. Actually, it's mostly my enemies who call me Kaine. I prefer Mike. Mike it is, then. So tell me, Helena now said. Have there been any losses since I last visited? Frida's face saddened. Tears shimmered in her eyes. I'm afraid so. Helena now looked concerned. So Thorn has been up to his dirty tricks again, has he? Frida quickly wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, then nodded sadly. We lost 5 of our women, she said, her eyes looking down blankly. It wasn't fair, we had no idea. Helena spoke again, now sounding angered. We'll get him, Frida. One day. Jez and I quickly exchanged glances. I nodded, and she looked at me with a knowing expression. Is there any way we can help? I asked, not sure whether my question was directed to Helena or Frida. Helena looked at Frida, as if passing on the question, and Frida looked up at me as if in response, her eyes clearing. We are a very independent group. My women are as tough as they come, and fearless. We don't normally allow strangers to interfere. I'm sorry, I said. It just sounds like maybe you could use a hand. Frida now looked almost arrogant, making me wonder if maybe I should have kept my mouth shut. To my surprise, Helena spoke on my behalf. Frida, she said. 5 women isn't a small loss. Besides, who knows how many of you will die under Thorn's hand in your next encounter. She quickly looked at me, then continued. Mike has been slaying vampires for 15 years now. He's the best there is. What do you know about slaying vampires? Frida demanded, sounding hurt. If we didn't fight back, we might have lost 10 women. Helena was about to reply, when I raised my hand. It's all right, I understand. If you feel it's wrong for us to get involved, I respect that. Neither Helena nor Frida said anything in response. 16. The flap of the tent was lifted, and Andrea's head peered in. She grinned. Hey, she said, any of you hungry? I brought some food. She ducked, then entered. She held a large tray which had 2 loaves of bread, cheese, and some fruit on it. "Thanks, Andrea," said Frida, sounding relieved at the distraction. "You're an angel," said Helena. Placing the tray before Jez and I, Andrea seated herself on a cushion next to Frida. "I'll get us something to drink," said Frida, and got up. As she raised the tent flap and stepped out, I caught another glimpse of her bare backside. To our surprise, Helena got up too. "I'll be right back," she said, and also left. "Please," said Andrea. "Help yourselves." "Thank you," said Jez, as she helped herself to a slice of bread and some cheese. I then proceeded to help myself too. The delicious-looking bread, which was hot and fresh, tasted perfect, and the cheese was very creamy. "This is delicious," said Jez. "Do you make your own bread?" "No," said Andrea, "Helena sends us a fresh supply every few weeks. We're very close." I nodded. "I can see why. Helena's one of the nicest people I've met." Andrea nodded. "They don't come much sweeter." She turned to Jez. "So what's it like, being the girl of the Savior?" Jez swallowed. "Well, to me he's just Mike. We prefer to keep all that religious-like mumbo-jumbo out of our lives." "Exactly," I added. "In fact, I don't really consider myself a savior, there's a lot of people I can't save." "I suppose that makes sense," said Andrea. "What a burden it would be." "It's mostly my mentor who sees me as a savior," I said. "It might just be his personal opinion." "So," said Jez, changing the subject, "what's it like living in a forest?" "Well," said Andrea, "for me, it's the only way to live. It's wonderful, being so close to nature. We have all the protection we need here. Only Helena and a few others know the way to our hideout." "If you don't mind me asking," I said. "What's the lowdown on Thorn?" Andrea's expression turned to one of sorrow. "He's the most evil being I've ever encountered, we lost several of our girls because of him. He's vicious and sadistic. Our quest to destroy him continues." I listened to the maiden with great interest. She told us tales of how Thorn had occasionally captured women from Frida's group and tortured them, only to kill some of them. When Andrea told us about their recent losses, I couldn't help but want to give them a hand. But would Andrea react the same way Frida had? The more I thought of it, the more I wanted to help them. The tent flap was lifted, and Frida stepped inside, followed by Helena. They were both holding trays, on which were jugs and plastic cups. "Hey, you guys," Frida said, in her strong German accent. "Sorry we took a while. Helena and I have brought you something to drink." Frida seemed to have gathered herself, and I guessed Helena may have had something to do with it. Jez, being the understanding person that she was, immediately took on that caring, familiar role that I'd come to love about her. I had a feeling that she and Frida would hit it off well together. "Thanks, you two," Jez now said. "This is such an amazing place to be, deep inside this forest. I feel like I'm in a fairy tale or something." She looked at Frida and beamed. Frida seemed to light up, looking grateful for Jez's understanding attitude. Helena seemed to catch on to Jez's attitude, and I smiled at her as if to say, "Lucky me, hey." Helena nodded knowingly, a smile of relief on her face. The two girls sat down, and we poured ourselves generous helpings of wine from the 2 jugs. We chatted generally, trying to keep the subject as casual as possible, the rest of us careful not to upset Frida. Maybe an hour later, Helena suggested that we get going. The girls had preparations to get done for the rest of the day, fortifying their defenses. We said goodbye to the fair maidens and headed off, Helena in the lead. I'd already made up my mind that I'd help the girls in any way I could. 17. The next couple of days went by quietly, with Jez and I relaxing and enjoying the tranquility of Helena's villa. My next checkup was fairly straightforward. It mostly involved relaxation exercises, and Helena finished off with some physiotherapy. My nauseousness had passed already, to a certain degree, and I was almost feeling 100% again. Helena also checked the wounds on my shoulder blades, and said they still seemed inclined to start bleeding again. She bandaged them again, with fresh gauze pads, and I could tell she was still completely miffed about them. Frowning, she said, "You might have to see a skin surgeon about them, Mike, they don't look like they're going to heal overnight." Finished with that day's session, I walked outside, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. Jez was sitting outside on a swing, gently swaying. She seemed to be deep in thought. My heart melted. I walked up to her, surprising her and pulling her out of her distant thoughts. "Hey beautiful," I said, sitting on the swing next to hers. "What's on your mind?" Jez shook her head casually. "Nothing. How'd the therapy session go?" "Pretty good, though the slits on my shoulder blades are still pretty sore. They've started bleeding again." Jez pouted, giving me that motherly look. "Maybe we should see a specialist surgeon, hey?" I nodded. That's what Helena suggested. "They've got me pretty miffed, too. How's everything else? Still feeling nauseous at all?" I shook my head. "No, thank God. That seems to have passed pretty quickly. I guess I was just working too hard." Jez smiled. "That's good to know. It's so relaxing here, I guess that helped a lot, hey?" I smiled back. "Yeah. This sure is a nice place. You know what? I reckon the two of us should get ourselves a villa, too. Now that I'm back in business, we should be able to afford ourselves one." Jez's eyes lit up. "Now there's an idea." I was thoughtful for a moment. Changing the subject, I said, "What did you make of our new friends?" "Are you kidding? I thought we'd walked into a magical forest, or something." I smiled. "Me too. Frida and Andrea were really something, hey?" "Yeah. Can't wait to go see them again." "Me neither." I decided not to tell her anything about giving them a hand, it seemed too soon. 18. The rest of the day went by quickly. At around 6:30, Helena suggested we go see a movie. Jez and I were delighted. I was curious about movies screened in German theaters, as I'd heard they were always dubbed. We left for the local movie theater around 7, and Jez and I were relieved to see there weren't any big crowds there. Helena suggested that we see Resident Evil, Extinction. Both Jez and I agreed. We found fairly good seats near the middle of the theater, and watched the amusing German ads while we waited for the movie to start. Even the movie trailers were dubbed in German. The movie finally started. Milla Jovovich's character of Alice was truly a sight to behold, in an outfit consisting of a brown trench coat and suspenders right out of a Little Woods catalog. The character had a personality so similar to Jez's that I almost commented, but stopped myself in time. Jez would have teased the pants off me. Both Helena and Jez obviously enjoyed the movie, and to me, the German dubbing wasn't too much of a distraction. There were very few moments where the dialogue seemed out of sync with the moving of the characters' lips. The occasionally graphic horror violence was rarely disturbing, though the zombies did have a very realistic feel to them. At the end of the movie, the carton in my hand still held a generous amount of popcorn. Being in a humorous mode, I disposed of it by giving it to the miffed girl sitting behind me. Outside the theater, we took in the low-key, yet beautiful nightscape of Dahlem. We had dinner at a cozy, semi-classy restaurant, then headed back to Helena's villa. As Jez and I lay in bed that night, we talked casually about our lives. It was a zen moment, as Jez and I seemed to come to terms with our lives. This was what we were. Vampire hunters. It wasn't something we could just shrug away. We had accepted our sense of duty, and were getting used to the rough but interesting way of life. And yet, after Jez fell fast asleep, I continued to stay deep in thought, wide awake. Deep down, I knew we deserved something better. There had to be a better way of life to look forward to. For both of us. I fell asleep. 19. The next morning, we got up after 9 o'clock, and had breakfast in bed, with compliments from Helena. The crispy bacon and eggs were cooked to just the right taste, and was accompanied by toasted homemade bread, spread with the best German butter. "Helena really is a darling, isn't she?" said Jez, munching on her last bit of toast. "Yeah," I said, finishing off the last of my bacon, "a real angel." Later in the afternoon, Helena told us she was going to the Eternal Forest to give the girls a fresh supply of bread, and that we were welcome to come along. "Sounds good to me," said Jez. "Great," I said. We left around 11:15, Helena carrying a basket of bread while Jez and I carried jars of jam and marmalade. The walk wasn't the least bit grueling, and we enjoyed the sunshine a great deal. When we reached the entrance, Helena made the usual, high-pitched cry. To our surprise, we heard no reply. Helena, looking miffed, made the bird-like cry once more, louder this time. Still no answer. Helena now looked worried. "Something must have happened," she said. "We'd better hurry." We quickly made our way through the forest, Helena in the lead. The route we took was slightly shorter than the one we used when Frida led us to her camp. Soon enough, we entered the camp's clearing, only to find the girls running amok in chaos. We spotted Frida, who was in tears, mumbling incoherently to one of her girls. The three of us quickly ran up to her. "Frida," Helena said. "What's wrong? What happened?" Frida turned to us, wiping her eyes. "It's Andrea. They took her. The bastards." "Who?" Helena looked into her friend's eyes, gripping her by the shoulders. Frida sniffed. "Who do you think?" "Thorn his men. We have to save her." Helena nodded. "All right. Calm down. We'll get her back, whatever it takes." I put my hand on Helena's shoulder. "We can help." Frida's eyes turned to me, she looked like she felt betrayed. When she spoke again, she sounded angry. "Men, you're all the same." Helena nodded to me, then guided Frida over to a tree. They talked for a couple of minutes. I couldn't hear anything they said. Jez and I waited impatiently. Soon enough, Helena came over to me. "We've got a serious problem," she began. "Some of Thorn's men took the camp completely by surprise. They've kidnapped Andrea." I nodded. "How can I help?" Helena frowned. "We'll need a plan. I suppose the best way to go would be a sneak entrance into their fortifications. The girls have plenty of weapons." Jez and I exchanged glances. "All right," I said. "Jez and I will try and rescue Andrea. Maybe it's best if you stay here with the camp." Helena looked uncertain. "It might be better if I came along too. Are you familiar with using stakes?" She nodded. "Frida's given me a few lessons before." I thought for a couple of seconds. "Why don't you stay further back, while Jez and I go in? That way, if we run into trouble and need help, you can run back here and notify the girls." Helena looked doubtful. "Maybe I should go in too." Jez interrupted her. "It's too risky. We'll need backup." Helena suddenly looked as if she'd had a beam of light stuck in her face. "I know, why don't we leave Frida to back us up? She's faster than me, and can easily run back to camp without leaving even the slightest chance for those bastards to catch her." Jez looked at me as if in question, and I nodded. "That sounds like a good plan." 20. Armed with 3 stakes each, we took a tricky path around the enchanted forest, entering it again from its western border. This took us roughly an hour and 15 minutes. I was astounded at how large an expanse of land the forest consisted of. It was no wonder the rival groups were both able to live in it while being enemies. We stopped maybe 50 yards into the forest. Frida spoke before I could. "I'll wait around here. You 3 go on and have your stakes ready. At the slightest sign of trouble, I'll notice." I'll run straight back to our camp to notify the girls. Helena looked at me as if seeking approval. I nodded. All right, Frida, said Helena, turning to the girl. Please be careful, they might jump you when you least expect it. Don't worry, Frida said, once again sounding overconfident. I'll keep watch carefully. Now go. The three of us left Frida, without any further delaying. We kept going straight, following a rough path that seemed to have been trampled into the ground. Helena suggested that we keep a lookout for a slight lowering of the ground, which should be in the vicinity of the entry into Thorn's hideout. Sure enough, we eventually found ourselves feeling as though we'd suddenly stepped onto the deep end of a pool. As we kept moving forwards, we came across a small clearing, which in turn had a rough path leading away from it, into what appeared to be a clump of trees which was overgrown, as if intended to cover an opening, further ahead. I surprised myself at how intelligent I was, being able to figure out such a thing, which this thorn most likely thought would have the opposite effect on us, as though we might assume it to be an area too thick with foliage, thus seeming unlikely to lead to anywhere but more foliage. As we progressed beyond the cluster of close-knit trees, we spotted something that gave away our destination. The top of a tree further ahead seemed to have some sort of wooden structure built onto it. There didn't seem to be any guards on it, though, which surprised me. I still thought it best we proceed with extreme caution, there was no telling where any of Thorn's men might pounce from. All right, I said, trying to keep my voice as quiet as possible. I'm gonna go in first, you two follow me, but keep your distance. The girls nodded. Crouching low, I slowly made my way past the trees, onto more sloping ground. A little further ahead, was another clearing. This particular one was huge. As I'd guessed, it turned out to be Thorn's camp. I stared at the massive hideout with curiosity and a little apprehension. There were very few vampires in sight. The ones who were visible seemed to be engaging in pulling certain contraptions and other odds and ends into place, as though preparing a setting for some event. I looked over my shoulder. The girls were a few paces behind me, also crouched, as if awaiting a signal from me. I beckoned, and they crept forwards and stopped close behind me. No sign of Andrea, I whispered. She might be in one of the tents. What are they doing? Asked Jez, trying to look over my shoulder. I'm not sure. Looks like they're making preparations for something. We watched silently as several figures in dark clothing went about setting up a large wooden platform which was backed by a wall, also made of wood. We were still trying to figure out what they were assembling when I felt a sharp pain on the side of my neck. My vision blurred, I could barely make out two figures in similar clothing to the men below. As they loomed above the girls, who turned around in surprise, I became nauseous and passed out. 21. Mike. Mike. Wake up. I opened my eyes, my vision was blurry. It then started to clear. In front of me was Jez, shaking me by the shoulder. When my vision became clear, I saw that we were in some sort of wooden cage. It was dark, and didn't smell very pleasant. Helena was sitting at the opposite end, looking at us. She looked nervous. What's going on? I mumbled, my eyes turning to Jez. We've been taken prisoner, that's what. I shook my head. Great. Is that all you've got to say? I felt myself dozing off again, so Jez shook me even harder. All right, I managed. Just give me a minute to get fully awake. Maybe this'll help. All of a sudden, my face was hit by icy cold water. Hey! I said. Cut it out. Jez put down the metal mug she'd used, then slapped my cheeks. Did that wake you up? I nodded. Yeah, sure did. How'd we get inside this cage? I looked up, and saw nothing but sky, framed by clumps of foliage. Two of those darn vampires sneaked up on us from behind, then grabbed us. They used some kind of dart on your neck. A tranquilizer, I said, then rubbed the side of my neck. Right. After that, they took us prisoner, and dumped us into this hole. Thanks God it's not much deeper. We'd better find a way to get out and fast, said Helena. Her expression turned serious. God know what they've done with Andrea. I hope it's not too late for her. Don't worry, I said, trying to sound as reassuring as possible. If she's here, we'll do our best to rescue her. We'll have to get out of this goddamn hole, first, said Jez, wrinkling her nose at the smell. I thought for a couple of minutes. All right, I said. This audio file was created by Panopreter Basic. You can download it at www.panopreter.com. We might not be able to get out of here ourselves. I mean, it's not like we've even got any rope or anything. If we try to climb the walls, we'll only end up clawing at the dirt. Jez frowned, looking around. I suppose you've got a point. So, I continued. I think the best thing to do would be to wait until they free us. I don't think they're gonna leave us here forever. Jez nodded. They'll probably keep a close eye on us, though even when they let us out of here. Yeah, but such an opportunity might be all we need. Just one moment with their eyes off us, and we could make a run for it. At least one of us could. Which reminds me, Jez now said. Frida didn't get captured with the rest of us. She probably made it back to the girls' camp. She might be on her way even now, with some of the girls for backup. I hope so. But we still have a chance to get out of here on our own. Like I said, we'll just wait for these bloodsuckers to let us out of here. Helena looked from me to Jez and nodded. I agree. There doesn't seem to be anything we can do at the moment. So let's wait, I said, and sighed. None of us said a word again for the next 20 minutes or so. Then, we heard voices approaching from above, and perhaps 5 or 6 feet away. Shortly afterwards, a couple of faces looked down at us, wide grins appeared on them. Well, hello there, said one of them. I hope you didn't find your accommodation too uncomfortable. The other laughed. Thorn doesn't want the three of you to miss the show. He looked at his comrade, nodded, and then looked down at us once more. Stay put, we shall send down a rope ladder. About to leave, he looked down at us once more, and said, and don't try anything funny, you're already in deep shit. The mean-spirited vampire walked away, leaving his comrade to guard us. The vampire who remained behind looked down at us with a smug expression on his face. I sat back, suddenly wincing. My shoulder blades were throbbing with pain. 22. Maybe 10 minutes later, a length of secure-looking rope ladder was thrown over the edge of the pit's mouth. It reached down to our shoulders when we stood up. One of the two wisest vampires peered over the edge again. All right, you three. Climb up. And if any of you try anything, we'll make you sorry. Jez, you go first, I said. You next, Helena. Jez gripped the rung before the last on the rope ladder, and started to work her way up the wall of the pit, the heels of her boots digging into the dirt. She soon got a sturdy hold on the somewhat loose ladder, and proceeded up gradually, trying not to sway too much. After she was free of the pit, Helena followed suit. I went next, and stood up once I was out of the pit. I looked around. There were as many as 5 vampires surrounding us, all of them watching us intently. We'd have to be stupid to try and make a run for it. One of the vampires, who'd been leering at Helena, spoke. We were hoping you might drop by, Kaine. Thorn has waited a long time to finally get to meet you. He doesn't take very kindly to sneaking, however. But he's not always mean. In fact, we were just about to enjoy a special show, starring none other than your comrade Andrea. Thorn has decided to let you three have front row seats. Generous, isn't he? I've got a bad feeling about this, I said to Jez, and winced when my shoulder blades burned again. Me too, she almost whispered. Then, we'd better think of something. I nodded grimly. A sudden scream caught our attention. The three of us turned our heads in the direction it had come from, and got a shock. It was Andrea who had screamed. She was being dragged over the rough ground by two of Thorn's vampires. She was naked, and looked like she'd been through a horrible ordeal. She now begged for mercy as the vampires dragged her, none of them showing any reaction to her pleas. We realized she was being dragged over to the large wooden contraption, which was being set up when we were spying on the hideout. I was about to say something to Jez, when a supremely evil-looking vampire came out of one of the large tents. He was very tall, had long dark hair, and was dressed completely in black. I figured this grand-looking character had to be Thorn. He now looked on with approval as the two henchmen forced Andrea onto the platform of the large wooden structure. Thorn insisted that the three of you watch what happens to your friend, one of the vampires guarding us now said. So go over to those rocks over there, and sit down. We'll be keeping our eyes on you, so don't try anything you'll regret. Now move it. We did as the vampire said. As I sat down, my shoulder blades burnt with pain, and I almost cried out. The rocks weren't exactly comfortable, but sitting down was definitely better than standing. As I sat there with Jez and Helena, I desperately tried to think of a way to rescue Andrea. There just had to be a way. But as we sat there, helpless, the show had already begun. Andrea looked filthy, and had scratches and bruises all over her. Now, as the two vampires forced Andrea against the wooden wall up on the platform, their movements made her breasts shake wildly. "Please," she cried. "Please don't hurt me. I'll do anything you want." One of the vampires grinned. "It's a little too late for that, you stupid wench. Now don't make a move, Thorn will take over from here." The lecherous vampire exchanged a grin with his comrade. We watched helplessly as Thorn walked up to the wooden platform, while Andrea cringed, a terrified look on her face. 23. "Behold," Thorn shouted. "What have we here?" His eyes roamed up and down over Andrea's nude body. "A vampire hunting maiden. How unfortunate for her that she was captured." He leaned close to her, his nose inches from hers. The poor girl recoiled. "Are you scared, maiden?" To our surprise, Andrea spat on Thorn's face. Thorn only grinned, then wiped off Andrea's spittle from his cheek. Now that wasn't a very nice thing to do. Thorn glanced at his comrades. His comrades shook their heads in unison, some of them leering, others laughing. A moment passed. A moment that seemed like eternity. Suddenly, Thorn opened his mouth wide, and violently gripped the poor girl's neck by his fangs. She screamed hysterically, blood spurted from her jugular. The screams continued, occasionally accompanying a gurgling sounding. Thorn then proceeded to tear a chunk of flesh out of Andrea's neck. Her screams stopped abruptly. Andrea's eyes were now open wide, a look of sheer terror frozen on her face. Her mouth was still open wide. A few spasms shook her before she eventually went limp. Jez, Helena, and I watched helplessly as the girl died. "Those bastards," said Helena, her voice hardly loud enough to be heard. "Frida isn't going to let this go easy." Speaking of Frida, I wondered if she'd run back to get help, yet. I figured she must have. It was likely more than 2 hours since we'd been captured. Now, as we watched on, Thorn's henchmen lifted Andrea's carcass off the platform and dumped it on the ground. One of the henchmen spoke to Thorn, who then turned around to look at us. He eyed us inquisitively, nodding as his ally spoke to him. Thorn then proceeded to give one of his henchmen some orders, to which the henchman nodded. He then proceeded to walk over to us. "Thorn wants a word with the three of you," he said. "Get up." Jez, Helena, and I got up from our sitting positions on the rocks, still angry at what had been done to Andrea. My shoulder blades were now hurting so bad that I wondered if blood may have seeped onto the back of my shirt. We were then escorted over to Thorn's large tent, into which the sadistic bastard had already retired to, obviously exhilarated from what he'd done to poor Andrea. Inside the tent, we looked around. It was luxuriously furnished. Thorn sat near a corner, a book in his hand. Its title was Blood is Thicker Than Water. It was written by a Wang Feng. Obviously this wasn't the time to be amused. Putting down the book, Thorn eyed the three of us. He nodded to his henchman, who left. "Sit down, please," Thorn said politely. We seated ourselves on 3 beanbags opposite the repulsive vampire. "First of all," he began, "I must say the 3 of you are as stupid as they come, walking into my camp the way you did, and getting caught the way you have." The 3 of us watched him in silence. "I'll have you know that I'm offended that you barge in this way, but there is a silver lining." He now looked directly at me. "Having said that, I must say I'm glad to finally have gotten the chance to meet you, Kaine. I've heard so much about you." "Really?" I said. "I'd never heard about you, until Helena told me about you." Thorn laughed. It was the laugh of a madman who believed in hedonism. "I can see you're keen to offend me, Kaine. But tell me, are you not a murderer yourself?" Obviously, I didn't say a word. Thorn then nodded. "I can see how your attitude is going to be, Mikhail." A moment later, the same henchman who'd taken us into the tent appeared. "Take this lot into the prison chamber, lock them up." 24. We were roughly escorted out of the tent, and taken across the large camping area to an area that seemed overgrown with trees, concealing a slanting roof to what appeared to be some sort of underground dungeon. A trapdoor was opened by the henchman, and the 3 of us were roughly pushed in through the opening. We hit the ground underneath with a manageable oomph, the impact slightly jolting us. A stab of pain ran through my shoulder blades, making me cry out. "Mike," said Jez. "Are you okay, sweetie?" I nodded, grimacing and deciding not to say anything about my nagging shoulder blades. It seemed irrelevant under the circumstances. The trapdoor above was shut with a bang. Darkness filled the musty dungeon. We sat down on the soiled ground, feeling helpless. There didn't seem to be anything we could do but wait. Maybe 5 minutes after we'd sat down, Helena suddenly started crying. "I can't believe she's gone," she sniffed. "Andrea was the sweetest girl, she was loved by all of us. She was the kindest person. That bastard, we have to make him pay." I was about to say something, when Jez suddenly interrupted me. She was singing. "Dear my love, haven't you wanted to be with me? And dear my love, haven't you longed to be free? I can't keep pretending that I don't even know you. And at sweet night you are my own. Take my hand. We're leaving here tonight." As Helena continued to sob and sniff, I recognized the song Jez was singing as Anywhere, by Evanescence. I didn't interrupt her, I just closed my eyes, and let her beautiful, soothing voice calm me down. "We're leaving here tonight. There's no need to tell anyone. They'd only hold us down. So by the morning light, we'll be halfway to anywhere. Where love is more than just your name." 25. A whole hour went by, with the 3 of us just sitting there, helpless. My shoulder blades weren't hurting too badly now, since I'd been still for such a long while. We definitely had no choice but to wait for someone to come and open the trapdoor. There was absolutely no way out of there otherwise. My only hope was that maybe Frida would be returning with more help, maybe in large numbers, we'd be able to defend ourselves long enough to get out of here. So we waited. Finally, maybe 3 hours later, the trapdoor opened with a loud groan. A henchman looked down at us. "How's the air down there?" he asked, sounding amused. Then, "I've got some good news for the 3 of you. Thorn is in a generous mood. He wants the 3 of you to join him." The henchman straightened up and looked away. "Angus," he shouted. "Bring over the rope ladder." Soon enough, the rope ladder was thrown down over the edge of the trapdoor's opening. We gripped the rope taut and climbed out, the girls going first. When we stood on solid ground again, Mikhail came over to us. "Come with me, you 3, he now said. "Thorn has special plans for you. And don't try any funny stuff. We followed Mikhail over to where Thorn stood, near the platform on which he'd only hours ago killed Andrea. Andrea's body had been taken away. Thorn grinned. "I'll have you know I'm in a forgiving mood," he said. "So the three of you don't have to worry about suffering Andrea's fate. However, I do have something planned for you. Let me explain. Let's just say I'm somewhat of a wrestling fan. I love watching females getting down and dirty, fighting, of course. Kaine, you can join me as a spectator. I'm sure these two attractive young females will provide us with much entertainment. What do you say?" Helena and Jez looked at me as if also waiting for my answer. I pondered my thoughts carefully. "All of this is irrelevant, Thorn. You murdered an innocent girl in cold blood. I'm going to kill you. It's only a question of when." Thorn nodded. "I'm sure that's your intention, Kaine. In fact, that's just one of the reasons I'm holding you prisoner, but like I said, you're still free to watch the wrestling match with me. In fact, you don't really have a choice." He grinned. I just stood there silently. Thorn, now seeming a little impatient, turned to the girls. "All right, you two take your clothes off, this is nude wrestling." Helena and Jez both seemed reluctant, and looked at me as if seeking approval. I nodded. Or things could get ugly. The girls proceeded to undress themselves, and were soon standing naked, looks of expectation on their faces. "Onto the platform, ladies," Thorn gestured in the direction of the wooden platform. Reluctantly, Jez and Helena climbed up the short set of stairs, onto the platform. The warm sunlight seemed to accentuate the whiteness of Helena's buttocks, in comparison to Jez's, which had a more pinkish hue. I also noticed how large Helena's breasts were, which bobbed and swayed as she stopped right next to Jez on the platform. Thorn watched them lecherously. "Good," he said. "Mikhail is going to be the referee. Remember, this is wrestling, no punching or kicking allowed." He turned towards his other henchmen. "Angus, bring Kaine and I some chairs, will you?" Thorn then turned towards me, still grinning. "This is going to be some show." 26. Seated next to Thorn on a decked chair made of canvas and wood, the two of us awaited for the girls to commence. Mikhail stepped up onto the platform, a whistle hanging around his neck by a black noose. He looked over at Thorn, who nodded. "Fight!" shouted Mikhail, and stepped away from the women. Immediately, Jez and Helena grabbed each other, moving around in circles, leaning forwards. They kept trying to find a vulnerable area in each other. They'd occasionally find an area to lock onto, and hold tightly, but most of the time, the girl under attack would find a way to release herself before the referee blew the whistle. I watched with impatience and curiosity. On the one hand, I was angry at Thorn, on the other, I was angry at myself for finding interest in the struggle. It's a natural reaction, I reminded myself. The girls were now sweaty, their bodies gleaming and slick. The match was now on to round 3. A draw seemed to be the likely outcome. As the girls went at it once more, their feet firmly planted on the platform, a sudden whooshing sound caught my attention. I looked up to see a stake flying above my head. It slammed into Mikhail's chest, making him cry out in pain. He grabbed it frantically, trying to pull it out, but it was too late. The stake had already pierced his heart. He fell onto the platform with a final dismal cry, much to the surprise of the two girls, who were still clutching each other in iron grips. Helena and Jez let go of each other and looked at Mikhail's dead body, lying at their feet. Confused, they looked around them, as though trying to spot where the stake had been shot from. I looked above me and slightly to the left, also trying to pinpoint exactly where the stake had come from. Up on a tree, seated with her legs dangling from a branch, a stake bough in her hands, was none other than Frida herself. She quickly waved to me, then jumped off the branch, flipping and landing beautifully on the ground. As I looked around, I realized that there were other maidens hiding in the treetops also. Most of them carried stake bows, some of whom were already firing stakes at easy targets. Several of Thorn's men were dropping dead. Outraged, Thorn got up from his seat and shouted at the top of his voice. "Angus! Gather your men and take your positions, we're being ambushed." Several of Thorn's henchmen were now carrying guns, which I assumed they'd kept hidden under their belts or shirts. In the chaos that was going on, I was pretty busy myself, reaching under my jacket for my trusty stakes. Conveniently, one of Frida's girls threw me her stake bow, which I caught underhand. It was time to kick some vampire ass. 27. I simultaneously fired 2 stakes in 2 directions, both hitting their targets accurately. Both of Thorn's henchmen fell to the ground, dead. "Jez! Helena! Take cover!" I shouted. I ran in the direction Thorn had gone. The bastard had run straight for his tent. I figured he'd gone to grab a weapon. Even as I approached the tent, a stake readily placed in position on the stake bow, Thorn ran out, 2 automatic pistols grasped in each of his hands. He was already firing even as he exited the tent. He was a fast son of a bitch, that much was certain. I ducked for cover as I ran towards him, too late to fire the stake. I heard the bullets whiz past me. One grazed my shoulder, making me grimace and cry out an arg. The pain was tolerable, though, and Thorn soon had 3 fiery maidens to deal with. One of their stakes got him in the lower leg, making him temporarily vulnerable. The 3 maidens rushed towards him, a little too confident for their own benefit. Thorn suddenly darted his left arm up and fired, slugging a blonde maiden in the right breast. A spittle of blood shot from it, making her cry out in pain. She fell to a knee, then tried to crawl away. As she did so, Thorn pounced on her, having only just removed the stake from his leg. The wound pumped blood, but he didn't seem to care. He now licked his lips as he turned the helpless girl around, onto her back, and suddenly bit her jugular. Her shrill scream pierced the heavy air, which was already filled with the noises of desperate struggle. Thorn sucked ferociously on the girl's neck wound, while I watched helplessly, still recovering from my own shoulder wound. Meanwhile, the other 2 girls who'd been ready to attack Thorn were now struggling with 2 of the vampire's henchmen. "Helena! Jez! Catch!" I heard one of the girls shout, from somewhere above. Turning around, I saw Jez and Helena on the platform, raising their arms to catch the stake bows that had been thrown to them. Just afterwards, another maiden threw a pile of stakes onto the platform, right in front of the 2 girls' bare feet. Helena and Jez squatted down to pick up a stake each. They then jumped off the platform, while simultaneously loading their stake bows. Helena's breasts swung and jumped about wildly, as she hit the ground with a quiet thud. Jez's body was now dripping with sweat. Her buttocks quivered as she ran about, looking for appropriate targets. Another scream caught my attention. Snapping my head in the direction it had come from, I saw one of Frida's maidens screaming as if she'd lost her mind. As I saw why, I felt the anger in me rise, also making my shoulder blades pulse with pain. The poor girl's left lower leg had been completely chopped off, from just below her knee. Her left leg was now just a stump, with a raw, gaping wound at its end. The helpless maiden hopped around on her other leg, trying to keep her balance and falling. I realized the vampire who'd attacked the girl had used some kind of double-sided steel blade. Mustering as much strength as I could, I threw the stake at the bastard. It swooshed cleanly and got him in the side, just below his ribcage. He cried out, and pulled the stake out clumsily. Blood spurted from the wound. I was about to throw another stake at him, when I got a surprise. Just I was about to let go of the stake, another stake pierced him from behind, obviously finding his heart before emerging from his front. I looked over my shoulder to see who'd thrown the stake. It was none other than Frida herself. I turned around, to see how Jez and Helena were doing, still recovering from the pain in my shoulder. Helena was now wrestling with a big, very powerful vampire henchman, who kept delivering quick blows all over her. Her nose was broken, and bled continuously. The merciless vampire continued to attack her, making her cry out occasionally. Only a few of her own blows made it through to the vampire's more vulnerable areas. She obviously needed a hand. As if in answer, I heard Jez shout out Helena's name, and turned to see her throw a stake towards Helena, which the naked girl only just managed to catch, before stabbing the burly vampire in the left eye. He roared in outrage, giving Helena just enough time to quickly pull the stake out and find its next target, his heart. She then pushed with all her might, driving the stake in as far as it would go. The soles of her feet slid on the ground, the toes curled, indicating that she was trying to keep a steady grip on the ground while she pushed the stake in. With a ripping sound, it emerged from the vampire's back, and Helena finally let go of the henchman, gasping with relief. Just as I was about to push myself up, I got a blow on the left cheek. It stunned me, and I blinked to see who had delivered it. It was Thorn himself, who obviously now had his sights on killing me. We struggled, rolling over the ground. He occasionally delivered heavy blows with his fists, smashing me on my upper body, as well as hitting me in the face every now and then. I grimaced. If it wasn't for the pain in my shoulder blades, I probably would have stood a better chance of gaining the upper hand. Steeling myself with sheer determination, I refused to relent, and delivered as many as 5 blows to his face, continuously, and with great speed. He was soon bleeding from the nose, and one of his fangs was crooked. Suddenly, the vampire gripped me by the neck, as though trying to pin me to the ground. Naturally, I had a pretty good idea what his next move would be. So I smashed him in the stomach with my knee, making him oomph and loosen his grip. This gave me some slack, which was all I needed to pull him to his knees, having grabbed him by the collar of his shirt. "Mike! Take this!" I heard from behind me. I looked around quickly and saw Jez throw me a stake. I caught it backhanded, and twirled it in my hand, ready to strike at Thorn's heart. The stake had been pushed into his chest maybe a centimeter, when I felt something sharp push at the base of my own neck. "No you don't," said a calm, breathy female voice. 28. I slowly turned my head around, the sharp tip of my stake still pushing at Thorn's chest. Standing behind me was Frida, her chest heaving as she puffed and panted from exertion. Her clothes were torn here and there, the rags of her top hung loose and lopsided, leaving her left breast completely bare. The nipple was jutting out like a fingertip, red and glistening with sweat. "He's mine," she now said. "The bastard killed Andrea in cold blood." Her expression was one of pure revenge, showing not the slightest shred of forgiveness. I realized I didn't have much choice in the matter. I slowly nodded, then withdrew the stake grasped in my hand, getting up gingerly as I did so. In a second, with me out of the way, Frida's stake was exactly where mine had been, pushing at Thorn's heaving chest. The vampire didn't show any immediate sign of defeat, however, his expression was one of pure arrogance. It were as though he were silently stating that the damage had already been done. His eyes watched Frida mockingly. I could understand why the woman hated this vampire so much. Frida waited perhaps 10 more seconds, her eyes now showing pure hatred, mixed with frustration and anger. In the few seconds that Thorn had left, he spoke victoriously. "Your comrade Andrea," she screamed like a whore when I tasted her. "She was the most delicious meal I'd ever had," he grinned leeringly. "Bastard," cried Frida, and suddenly pushed at the stake with all her might. It pierced Thorn's chest cleanly, going nearly all the way in. The vampire suddenly looked weak, lifeless as his breathing stopped. Blood welled up around the stake wound as he dropped sideways, dead. My eyes turned to Frida. She was red with rage, panting heavily. She suddenly let out a furious argh, then let go of the stake, which was now stuck in Thorn's chest. I gently put a hand on her shoulder. She blinked several times, her lower lip between her teeth. She looked around, as if still trying to grasp what had happened. "Come on," I said, gently. "He's dead. There's no one left to save. Let's go." Frida nodded spontaneously, her face showing nothing but defeat. I gently escorted her away from the evil vampire's dead body. We now looked around. The camp was strewn with several dead bodies, some were Frida's maidens, while others were Thorn's men. The struggle had completely subsided. I looked for Jez and Helena. Spotting Jez pulling out a stake from the chest of a vampire, using her feet for leverage, I called out to her. Jez! Get over here! Dropping the stake to the ground, she looked over her shoulder. Nodding, she turned around and walked over to me and Frida. Jez's naked body was now filthy, and had a few mild wounds on it. I also spotted Helena, who was embracing one of the maidens. She eventually let go of the girl and also walked over to us. Her dark pubic thatch was stark against her milky white skin. Once again, I was struck by how large her breasts were, which continued to jounce and sway with her movements. Soon, the entire group of remaining maidens was standing around us. We'd lost maybe as many as 10 girls. Overall, though, the maidens were victorious, considering that Thorn had now been permanently eliminated. After a quick talk with Helena and Frida, all of us left Thorn's camp, not bothering with the corpses that lay strewn around. 29. Back at the maidens' camp, we went about preparing a special funeral for Andrea, as well as for the other maidens we'd lost in the battle. We all lighted fires on wooden sticks topped with cloth doused in kerosene. Helena, with the help of some of the other maidens, built a pretty little grave for Andrea, surrounding it with floral wreaths. Jez and I closed our eyes in prayer, while Frida said her final goodbyes to Andrea. Andrea, she said. You were more than just a friend, you were the sister I'd always wanted. We shall forever carry you in our hearts. This isn't goodbye. Helena, Jez, and I stayed on with the maidens, helping them in any way we could. This consisted mostly of rearranging their camp. The end of Thorn was a great triumph to these girls. They now wouldn't have to worry about sneak attacks, in which their group members would be stolen away. It was a new beginning for them, and I felt it were right that we be with them as they commenced it. *****. 3 hours later, we said our goodbyes to the maidens, who lowered themselves to one knee in honor of me, as they'd done when they'd first greeted me. It's been an honor, Lord Kaine, Frida now said, her voice still shaky due to today's ordeal and loss. Please know that you are welcome here anytime. Jez and I thanked Frida for her hospitality, and I told her if she ever needed our help for anything, we'd be there for her. We also said a final goodbye to the maidens, then left with Helena. Due to Jez's and Helena's nudity, they had been given some extra outfits belonging to the maidens. As we walked home, it was a special treat for me to watch the girls' bare bottoms flex and jiggle all the way back to Helena's villa. Back at the villa, Helena suggested that I go over to her clinic, sit on the medical bed and wait for her. It was obvious that I was the only one with serious injuries. Both Jez and Helena had luckily escaped Thorn's camp with only a few scrapes and bruises. I decided that I'd only let her patch up my shoulder wound. I wasn't keen on having my shoulder blades checked again, the pain now seeming to have subsided. As I waited for Helena, I turned on her portable radio/CD/cassette recorder. I Drove All Night by Cyndi Lauper was playing on the radio. When Helena came into the room, I was about to take my shirt off, but then thought better of it. I don't think I'll need a full checkup, I said, feeling a little guilty for not being totally honest. It's just my shoulder, it got grazed by a bullet. Helena hesitated for a fraction of a second, but then nodded. All right. Just lift up your sleeve, Mike. I should be able to patch that up for you in 5 minutes. *****. Later that night, as I relaxed with Jez in the den, watching a dubbed version of Zombie 2, I had an idea. Hey Jez, I said. How about we go check the sights in Dahlem? We should probably get going tomorrow. Jez nodded. Sounds good to me. You sure you're up to it? Yeah, it's just my shoulder, I lied. My shoulder blades were throbbing again. Great, I'll go tell Helena. She was about to get up, when Helena suddenly came into the room. She held a cell phone in her hand. "Mike? It's Father Sanchez." I got up and took the cell phone from her. "Hello. Hello, Señor Kaine. How did the recovery phase go?" "Well," I said. "Let's just say my stay here wasn't boring." "Very good, my son." He cleared his throat. "Listen. I have an update for you, with some very valuable instructions." "An update? An update on what?" "On your very destiny, Señor. Now, listen to these instructions very carefully." "All right," I said, and listened intently. 30. Finished getting the instructions from Father Sanchez, I said my final farewells to the priest. If the instructions he gave me were followed accurately to the dot, I probably won't be seeing him again, or hearing from him again, either. Switching off the cell phone, I gave it back to a curious Helena. Jez also looked at me inquisitively, as if in great suspense. "All right," I said. "Jez, get dressed in some normal clothes. We're leaving the villa straight away." "Helena, thanks so much for everything, you've been really supportive to us." Helena nodded, a little bewildered. "Glad I could help, Mike." "Oh," I said, still in a hurry. "You wouldn't mind if I borrowed your portable stereo, would you?" Helena screwed her lips against her left cheek. "Go ahead, then, will you bring it back? If I don't, I'll get Father Sanchez to send you a new one, okay?" I grinned. A few minutes later, Jez appeared, dressed in black jeans, black boots and a white blouse and black leather jacket. "We'd better hurry," I said. "We don't have much time." We each hugged Helena, and said our goodbyes to her. As we left the villa on foot, Jez asked me why we weren't taking our luggage with us. "Let's just say we won't be needing it anymore." ******. Our first destination was the Gothic 14th century St. Anna, a beautiful church which was situated at the center of a picturesque little cemetery. The church's beautiful 18th century tower loomed above, as Jez and I weaved through the gravestones, and entered the now empty church. According to Father Sanchez, somewhere inside this church was a scroll, on which was written the frequency of an FM radio signal. This signal would be broadcast mostly in mono, with only fragments of it being in stereo. I was to record the signal, separate the segments which were in stereo, join them together, in the correct order, to make a single segment of stereo sound, then play this new piece of audio in reverse. The playback of this particular stereo segment would open the portal of salvation, which was a supernatural doorway to heaven itself. This was my reward of ascension. Naturally, I was determined to take Jez with me. According to Father Sanchez, only two beings could pass through the portal in a single opening. We now hurried through the church, passing several 14th century paintings depicting the life of Saint Anna. As we tried to figure out where the scroll may be hidden, we also passed the Crucifixion, a 15th century painting, which was accompanied by 11 late Gothic figures of saints and a 17th century Baroque pulpit. Jez and I searched the church thoroughly for the scroll containing the radio frequency, and finally came across it in a porcelain jar behind the altar. I quickly unrolled the faded, yellowed piece of paper and checked the fading writings on it. 107.34. Bingo! I said, and exchanged a grin with Jez. "Let's go." "Where are we off to next, Han?" Jez asked, handing me the carry bag containing Helena's portable stereo, which she was tired of holding. "We have to catch a train to east of the center of Berlin. There's another church there, which we have to pay a little visit to." This particular church, known as Marienkirche, was where the mystic radio signal would be most powerful. We only had 3 hours till the signal was broadcast, so we practically ran to the railway station. At the station we caught the first available train stopping at east of the center of the city of Berlin. Arriving at the Bahnhof Alexanderplatz station, we had only 10 minutes to spare. We practically ran to the Marienkirche, also known as St. Mary's Church, Jez puffing and panting behind me. Arriving at Karl Strasse, we hurried up the front stairs to the magnificent church's main entrance. Thankfully, as Father Sanchez had predicted, its doors weren't locked. 31. We quickly went over to where the church's baptismal font was situated. The beautiful Gothic font had 3 black dragons supporting it, and was decorated with the figures of Jesus Christ, Mary, and the Apostles. Jez and I removed the portable stereo from my carry bag and placed it at the foot of the font. I quickly switched it to radio mode. Jez handed me the unused cassette tape Helena had given her just before we'd left her villa, and I inserted it. I then proceeded to tune the radio to FM 107.34. The signal turned quiet from the previous hissing noise, which meant we'd definitely found a valid frequency. I checked my wristwatch. We had just under 6 minutes. I pressed record, and we waited with anticipation. Sure enough, in just after 5 minutes, we heard a signal. It was very poor quality, and the voice we heard sounded like it belonged to a female Satanist. The voice was strangely deep, sexual. It definitely sounded like pseudo-German. The signal lasted for just over 2.5 minutes, and I noticed how the portable radio's red stereo indicator only lighted up occasionally. After the signal was finished, we left the tape recording for another 30 seconds, just in case. We didn't hear any more audio signals, so I stopped the tape. Jez and I exchanged glances, grinning. "Let's go, babe, we're going home." ******. We caught a taxi to Schoenfeld Airport. When we got out of the cab, it was raining. As we walked into the airport, soaking wet, I felt exhilarated, like Jez's and my life were just beginning. We quickly went through customs, then boarded the first plane to California, a Lufthansa 747, 2 hours later. The flight was great, thanks mainly to the excited moods Jez and I were in. There were several in-flight movies to choose from. Jez and I both watched Rob Zombie's Halloween remake, which I was very impressed with. Jez literally jumped out of her seat during numerous scenes, much to my amusement. Arriving at Los Angeles International Airport, we took a quick flight to Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. We got there 45 minutes later, and felt relieved to be back home. I decided that we weren't going to delay opening the portal of salvation any longer than we needed to. We first caught a taxi to Jez's flat, where Jez insisted on making a quick phone call to her mother. I waited as patiently as possible in her living room, while she made the call. Finished, she came into the living room. "So," she said. "Where do we go from here?" "Let's try opening the portal at my apartment. We'll need to convert the sound recording into a new MP3 file first, remember?" Jez suddenly made an O with her mouth, then slapped her forehead. "Of course. I forgot all about that. Come on, we'd better get going." As we left her flat, I ignored the sudden jolt of pain which seemed to set my shoulder blades on fire. Epilogue. At my apartment, I quickly went to work hooking up my Sony 8-track tape deck to my computer, while Jez relaxed with a cup of tea, watching Pumpkinhead. Within half an hour, I'd managed to separate the stereo signals and join them into one single MP3 file. I then proceeded to burn it onto a CD as an extra procedure, since computers could be unpredictable, sometimes. I then slotted the CD into my Sony CD player, which had a powerful megawatt amp attached to it. This was bound to give us very clear and precise playback of the new audio track. I called Jez over. Jez was soon standing at my side. "Ready to leave Earth?" I asked her. She nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be, hon." "All right," I said. "Here goes nothing." I pressed the play button. The strange, deep voice of the German woman could be heard, loud and extraordinarily clear. Jez held my hand tightly, squeezing it. There was a brilliant flash of light. Strangely enough, it came from the television. We both watched in uncertainty, as the light emerging from the screen took on a red hue. This in turn, much to our horror, started to turn into liquid form. Jez moaned, obviously in fear. Somewhere at the back of my head, I heard a voice, strangely unfamiliar. It's blood. That stuff oozing out of the TV is blood. The strange shape seemed to become an entity of living flesh, right before our eyes. It continued to grow in size, and take shape, the shape of a towering figure, distinctly human, yet somehow unlike any creature we'd ever set eyes on. As the figure before us manifested into a familiar-looking form, I felt my heart sink. It was him. Dhrovu. Somehow, I'd made a big mistake. Strange, deep laughter filled my small living room, disturbingly echoing against the walls. Mike. Jez managed. Yet. Weren't you supposed to play the track in reverse? Jez's voice was whiny. Damn. All right, I said. Get back, Jez. I'll handle this. Jez squeezed my hand once, then let go. Dhrovu had almost finished manifesting. A few seconds later, he stood looming above me, a diabolical grin on his hideous mouth. You didn't forget about me, did you, Kaine? His strange, echoing voice sent a chill up my spine. This was followed by another shot of pain, from my shoulder blades. But the pain didn't stop there. It increased, making me grit my teeth and cry out an arg. I could feel my shirt tearing behind me, and the pain increased, spreading over my back. I could make out Jez's voice, somewhere just behind. My God, Mike, you're growing wings. I slipped my shirt off, freeing my arms of its confining sleeves. I could feel the wings still growing, continuing to expand to an astounding size. They were now very much a part of me. The pain finally began to subside. Kaine, Dhrovu looked me in the eyes. I've waited so long for this moment. As the demon spoke, I noticed he was growing a tail. A tail which continued to increase in size. It had a strange contraption at its end, which reminded me of those dinosaurs with spikes on their tails. Now, as I watched on, Dhrovu's tail swerved about, making slow circles in the air, occasionally rising up. I tried to think, still recovering from the pain in my back. Gotta think fast. Take cover, Jez. I shouted, even as Dhrovu ran towards me, his upper body slightly hulking. I moved quickly, getting out of his way just in time. He bumped into the large couch I'd just been standing in front of. Thankfully, Jez had moved over so she was leaning against the back wall of the living room, considerably out of harm's way. Suddenly, Dhrovu's tail whirled and smashed me on my left lower leg, taking me by surprise. I fell to the ground, only just stopping myself from getting my nose smashed. As I shook my head and stood up, I felt a change within me. My newly grown wings seemed to pulse with power, this power seemed to flow into my arms, and in turn flow all through my very being. As Dhrovu turned around, ready to pounce on me, I quickly picked up a chair, with surprising ease, and threw it at the fiend. It smashed him in the chest, but shattered with the impact. This seemed to anger him, and he suddenly ran at me, his eyes bright red, his tail waving in the air behind him. He slammed into me, driving me to the floor with him. We struggled for what seemed like an eternity, exchanging blows furiously, both of us occasionally finding our mark. At some point, I managed to squeeze out of his grasp, and took the opportunity to retreat for a moment, to get myself together. My nose was bleeding, and I had a terrible pain in my head. Mike! Look out! I suddenly heard Jez shout. I looked ahead of me and saw the coffee table come flying at me. I only just managed to jump out of its way. It smashed to smithereens against the wall behind me. As I watched Dhrovu prepare to attack me once more, I suddenly realized what I had to do. Jez! I shouted. The CD! Run over to the stereo system and press the reverse play button. And hurry! I looked Dhrovu in the eyes, as he realized what was about to happen. And turn up the volume. I continued to look into the fiend's eyes, fearless, determined. I had no idea how to destroy him. I'd already figured out that killing the freak would take more than just a stake through the heart. But even if we couldn't destroy the demon, maybe we could still escape through the portal of salvation, leaving Dhrovu behind. I suddenly heard the voice of the German woman again, louder than before, this time played in reverse. It didn't sound nearly as sinister now. Suddenly, a strong wind started to blow, enveloping the living room. It made things start to fly around: chairs, books, the telephone. I looked over my shoulder. The portal was now open. It wasn't as large as I'd expected it would be. It had just enough room for 2 persons to fit through, and was made up of the colors of the rainbow. It also gave me the impression that it consisted of a swirling group of stars, creating a chasm of light. Jez, what are you waiting for? Go through the portal. To my annoyance, she shook her head. Not without you, Mike. I can't. I was about to reply when Dhrovu's cold fist smashed me in the jaw, catching me completely unguarded. Stunned, I shook my head, trying to recover. When I opened my eyes again, I saw Dhrovu halfway up to the portal, while Jez looked on helplessly. He's about to go through the portal. Without hesitating, I ran at Dhrovu, pouncing and grabbing him by the tail. He suddenly swung it, making me get flung around by it. I held on tightly, determined to stop him from making it through. Unfortunately, Dhrovu was only a couple of feet from the portal now, so I was left with no choice. I let go of his tail and suddenly dived forwards, trying to intercept him by blocking the way. The last thing I remember was seeing a bright flash of light. To be continued in the 8th Angel, Wings of Destiny. This audio file was created by Panopreter Basic. You can download it at www.panopreter.com.